Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind noisy cities, glowing phone screens, traffic jams, and overflowing inboxes. Instead, we're wandering into a world where the loudest sound is water slowly trickling down a mountain, where the day begins long before sunrise, and where thousands upon thousands of tiny rice seedlings wait patiently to become the year's most important crop. So, find a comfortable spot, maybe fluff your pillow a little, settle under a warm blanket, and let your breathing slow down. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. For the next little while, we're traveling back through history to spend an entire spring alongside generations of farmers whose lives revolved around one remarkably stubborn little plant. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these relaxing history journeys, and subscribe if you're new here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, whether it's a quiet town, a busy city apartment, or somewhere in between. Leave your location in the comments. It's always fascinating to see just how far these sleepy history adventures can travel. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the day's worries drift quietly into the background, and together, we'll step into the cool mist of an early spring morning. Imagine standing at the foot of a mountain thousands of years ago. The air is crisp enough that each breath feels cool against your face. A pale gray sky stretches overhead, still undecided whether it wants to become morning. Mist clings to every hillside, wrapping the valleys in soft layers that seem almost too peaceful to disturb. Somewhere nearby, a rooster announces the coming day with complete confidence, despite being spectacularly early as usual. Roosters have apparently believed themselves to be management for several thousand years. Beneath your feet, the earth is damp from recent rain. Every step sinks slightly into rich, dark soil that has been worked by countless hands long before yours. Water flows gently from higher ground through carefully carved channels, feeding one narrow terrace after another in an endless staircase climbing the mountainside. At first glance, it almost looks like nature created these perfect steps herself. She did not. Every single terrace was carved by human hands. Thousands of hours of digging, thousands of baskets of soil, thousands of stones, carefully stacked to hold the mountains in place. Entire generations devoted enormous portions of their lives simply to convincing gravity to cooperate. It's an ambitious conversation to have with a mountain, but remarkably, people often won. Today, these terraces are among the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. Tourists arrive carrying cameras worth more than an ancient farming family might earn in several lifetimes. They stand on scenic overlooks, admire the shimmering reflections, take a dozen photographs, and wonder how breathtaking everything looks. The farmers who built them probably looked at the same slopes and thought, "Wonderful, another wall collapsed overnight." History has a charming habit of polishing away the difficult parts, but that's exactly why we're here. Tonight isn't about kings announcing glorious victories from marble palaces or famous generals pointing dramatically toward distant battlefields. Those people certainly existed, and they tend to receive rather generous amounts of attention in history books. Instead, we're spending time with the people whose names were almost never written down, the men and women who woke before dawn, the grandparents whose backs slowly curved after decades of planting, the children learning how to balance baskets across narrow stone paths, the families whose survival depended on weather that rarely bothered asking their opinion. For much of human history, rice wasn't simply food. It was life itself. It determined whether villages celebrated or mourned. It decided whether taxes could be paid. It influenced wars, trade, migration, political power, and even religious ceremonies. An emperor might issue magnificent decrees from hundreds of miles away, but none of those elegant documents meant very much if the rice fields failed. Paper, after all, is considerably less filling than dinner. Long before modern machinery transformed agriculture, every single rice plant demanded extraordinary patience. There were no roaring tractors climbing these mountain terraces, no diesel-powered transplanters, no satellite weather forecasts, no waterproof boots thoughtfully designed by marketing departments, just hands, feet, mud, water, and endless repetition. The work began before sunrise and often continued until the light faded behind distant hills. Every movement had been practiced since childhood, refined through generations until planting became almost rhythmic, almost meditative, almost, let's not exaggerate, standing bent over in cold water for hours is still standing bent over in cold water. History occasionally reminds us that traditional is sometimes another word for astonishingly uncomfortable. As we move through tonight's story, we'll meet farmers from ancient China, mountain villages in Japan, the Korean peninsula, and the spectacular rice terraces of Southeast Asia. Although each region developed its own customs, languages, beliefs, and techniques, they all shared something remarkably familiar. Spring meant work. Relentless work. Beautiful work. Necessary work. The first, seedlings of the season, could not wait, simply because someone felt sleepy nature has always maintained an impressively strict schedule. You'll discover how entire communities organize themselves around the rhythm of planting season. We'll explore the rituals performed before the first seedling entered the mud, the songs that helped exhausted workers keep their pace, the engineering that transformed impossible mountains into fertile farmland, and the quiet resilience required to repeat the same demanding cycle year after year. We'll also meet some rather unusual historical characters along the way. There were officials who believed they could improve farming by writing very confident instructions from comfortably dry offices. There were wealthy landowners who rarely touched mud themselves but possessed surprisingly detailed opinions about how quickly everyone else should work. History, it seems, has never suffered from a shortage of enthusiastic supervisors. And then there were the ordinary farmers, the people who actually knew what they were doing. Funny how that works. But despite the long hours, aching muscles, and occasional disasters brought by storms, insects, or floods, there was something deeply satisfying about watching neat rows of bright green seedlings spread across a flooded terrace. Each tiny plant represented possibility. Each careful movement carried hope. Not dramatic hope, not cinematic hope, accompanied by orchestral music. Just the quiet hope that enough rain would fall, enough sunshine would arrive, and enough grain would fill the storage baskets before winter returned. Sometimes history changes through great battles. Sometimes it changes one seedling at a time. Tonight, we'll slow ourselves to that ancient pace. We'll walk the narrow stone paths between terraces where the water mirrors the pale morning sky. We'll listen to frogs beginning their daily chorus, watch mist lift from the valleys, and follow generations of anonymous workers whose lives shaped civilizations without ever expecting recognition. So take one more slow breath Let your shoulders relax. Leave the modern world behind for a while. Ahead of us, the first light of spring is beginning to touch the mountain terraces, and somewhere in the cool morning air, thousands of delicate rice seedlings are quietly waiting for careful hands to carry them into the flooded fields. Our journey begins just before dawn, when the villages are still asleep. The mountains remain wrapped in mist, and only a handful of lanterns flicker gently against the darkness as another planting season prepares to begin. In the next section, we'll step into the first spring before dawn, following a farming village as it wakes in the hours before sunrise and prepares for the first day of transplanting. Part 2. The first spring. Before dawn, long before the first rays of sunlight reached the highest mountain peaks, the village was already beginning to wake. Not all at once, of course. History rarely worked like a dramatic movie, where everyone suddenly threw open their doors at exactly the same moment. Real villages were much quieter than that. One family stirred while another still slept. A single lantern glowed in one house, while its neighbor remained wrapped in darkness. Somewhere, a dog decided that absolutely nothing was happening and promptly went back to sleep. A cat, on the other hand, believed everything belonged to it, including the entire village. Some things, apparently, have remained wonderfully consistent throughout history. The air carried the sharp chill of early spring. Winter had loosened its grip, but it had not completely surrendered. Thin layers of mist floated over the flooded terraces below the village, turning the mountains into soft gray silhouettes. Water reflected the stars so perfectly that, for a brief moment, it seemed as though the heavens had slipped quietly onto the earth. Inside one small wooden house, an elderly woman was already feeding the fire. She moved carefully, almost automatically, adding dry sticks collected during the previous autumn. Every motion had been repeated thousands of times over her lifetime. She no longer needed to think about it. The fire caught slowly, crackling as tiny sparks danced upward into the smoky darkness. Soon the smell of burning pine mixed with the comforting scent of steaming millet porridge. It wasn't an extravagant breakfast, no roasted feasts, no sweet pastries, certainly no oversized coffee served in cups bearing inspirational slogans. Just simple food that could keep tired bodies moving through a very long day. Nearby, her husband quietly inspected a bundle of planting ropes. The cords were made from twisted straw and marked with evenly spaced knots. These weren't decorative. They served as guides, helping workers plant seedlings in straight lines. Neat rows made weeding easier later in the season, improved water flow, and allowed each plant enough room to grow. It turns out ancient farmers appreciated organization long before spreadsheets were invented. Across the village, similar scenes unfolded. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Young mothers wrapped babies against their backs. Teenagers quietly complained about waking before sunrise. The exact words have been lost to history, but somehow it's easy to imagine. Every generation seems convinced it is the first to discover the tragedy of early mornings. Outside, the village well became one of the first gathering places. Women arrived carrying wooden buckets, suspended from shoulder poles polished smooth by years of use. They exchanged soft greetings, careful not to disturb neighbors who still slept. Conversation stayed gentle. There would be plenty of talking later. For now, everyone was listening listening to the wind, listening for rain, listening to birds, whose morning songs often revealed subtle changes in weather. Long before thermometers, satellites, or weather apps confidently predicting sunshine before producing thunderstorms, farmers relied on careful observation, the direction of the breeze, the thickness of morning mist, the smell carried through damp forests, the behavior of insects, the songs of frogs, even the appearance of distant mountain peaks. Every detail mattered. Centuries of experience had taught them that nature often whispered before she shouted. The oldest farmers became experts at reading those whispers, not because they possessed magical powers, because making mistakes carried enormous consequences. If planting began too early, an unexpected cold spell could destroy delicate seedlings. Too late, and the harvest might not mature before autumn temperatures dropped. There was only a narrow window. Miss it, and an entire year's food supply could disappear. No pressure, then. As the eastern sky slowly lightened from black to deep blue, another sound drifted across the valley. The steady clunk, clunk, clunk of wooden pestles pounding grain. Several households were preparing extra rice cakes for workers who would spend the entire day standing ankle-deep in flooded fields. The rhythm echoed gently through the quiet morning like a slow heartbeat. It was a sound that had greeted countless generations. If someone from 1,500 years ago had wandered into this village, they would have recognized it immediately. History changes surprisingly slowly when your greatest concern is feeding everyone before winter. By now, faint lanterns dotted the narrow pathways leading toward the terraces. One by one, villagers emerged carrying woven baskets, planting tools, bundles of seedlings, and broad straw hats tucked beneath their arms. The hats wouldn't be necessary just yet. The sun had not risen, but everyone knew what waited later. Hours beneath bright spring skies, reflecting off shallow water, could leave skin painfully burned. Ancient farmers understood sunlight perfectly well. They simply lacked advertisements reminding them every 5 minutes. At the edge of the village stood a small shrine. Nothing grand, just weathered wooden beams, a simple stone platform, and offerings left by generations who hoped the spirits of mountain, water, and field might look kindly upon another planting season. Before heading into the terraces, several families stopped there. An elderly man bowed deeply. A young woman placed fresh flowers beside an older offering that had begun to fade. A child copied the adults, peeking curiously with one eye half open to make sure they were doing everything correctly. The gods, one imagines, were probably accustomed to such enthusiastic improvisation. Throughout East Asia, communities developed different traditions surrounding rice cultivation. In ancient China, ceremonies honoring agricultural deities often accompanied the beginning of planting season. In Japan, local shrines dedicated to rice spirits received offerings of sake, rice cakes, salt, and evergreen branches. Across Korea, villages performed seasonal rituals, asking for favorable weather and protection against pests. Farther south, throughout Southeast Asia, rice itself was sometimes believed to possess a spirit deserving careful respect. Different languages, different customs, different prayers, yet the hope remained remarkably similar. Please let this year be enough. Please let our children eat. Please let the storms pass gently. Please let the harvest survive. History often remembers the speeches of emperors. It rarely records the whispered prayers of ordinary farmers, and yet those quiet voices probably outnumbered imperial proclamations by several million. Beyond the shrine, the terraces stretched across the mountainside like enormous staircases carved into the earth. In the growing light, each flooded field reflected the awakening sky. Pink clouds shimmered on perfectly still water. Tiny ripples spread whenever frogs leaped from one grassy bank to another. Dragonflies hovered above the surface despite the cool morning air. Everything seemed almost impossibly peaceful, which is fortunate, because within the hour, dozens of people would be marching directly into all that beautiful mud. The first workers reached the nursery beds. Here, weeks earlier, carefully selected rice seeds had been sown close together in protected plots. Thanks to warmer soil and careful watering, they had grown into carpets of vibrant green seedlings, each only a few inches tall. Seen together, they looked almost like thick emerald grass. Soon, they would begin a far more difficult journey. Women knelt first. Their experienced fingers slipped beneath clusters of seedlings with remarkable gentleness. Roots remained intact. Stems stayed unbroken. The young plants were gathered into small bundles, tied loosely with strips of ricey straw. Watching skilled workers perform this task was almost hypnotic. Fast, precise, patient. No movement wasted. Nearby, younger children carried the bundles toward larger baskets. Older boys balanced them carefully across bamboo shoulder poles. The smallest children wanted desperately to help. Adults usually found them safer jobs. History teaches us that enthusiasm and efficiency are not always close relatives. One particularly elderly farmer paused before entering the first terrace. His grandchildren watched curiously. He crouched slowly, scooped up a handful of muddy water, let it run gently between his fingers, then nodded almost imperceptibly. The temperature felt right. The soil felt soft enough. The season had arrived. No written document announced this decision. No official seal. No royal messenger galloping through mountain villages. Just decades of experience held in weathered hands. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Not through books, but through observation, imitation, and countless shared mornings exactly like this one. The village headman finally raised his voice. It wasn't a speech. No inspiring declaration destined for history books. Simply a practical reminder. Stay together. Mind the terrace walls. Watch your footing. Carry enough water. And if anyone sees the buffalo wandering into the wrong field again, kindly persuade him that today's adventure should happen somewhere else. The buffalo, historians regretfully report, probably had his own opinions. The first workers stepped into the flooded terrace. Water rippled around their ankles. Mud welcomed them with remarkable enthusiasm, gripping their feet firmly enough to suggest it had no intention of letting go. One cautious step, then another. Soon neat rows of planters spread across the shallow water. Each carried bundles of bright green seedlings against the muted browns of wet earth and the silver reflections of dawn. Behind them, the mountains slowly emerged from the mist as sunlight finally touched the highest peaks. Spring had truly begun, and with it started one of humanity's oldest, slowest, and most astonishingly patient forms of work, a task repeated by countless anonymous hands across thousands of years, one tiny rice seedling at a time. The next chapter, Choosing the Rice Seed, explores how ancient farming families carefully selected, stored, and protected the precious seeds that determined whether an entire year's harvest would succeed or fail. Part 3. Choosing the Rice Seed. The time the first terraces had filled with workers, the most important decision of the entire farming season had already been made. It hadn't happened that morning, or even that month. It had happened many months earlier, just after the previous harvest, when the grain was dry, the storage baskets were full, and every family faced a choice that would quietly shape the following year. Which rice should become food, and which rice deserved the chance to become the future? It sounds like a simple question. It wasn't. Not even close. For an ancient farming family, selecting seed rice was one of the most serious responsibilities of the year. A careless decision could reduce yields, weaken future crops, or leave an entire household dangerously vulnerable if the next growing seasons turned difficult. There were no laboratories, no certified seed companies, no colorful bags promising improved performance, no agricultural hotline waiting to answer questions. There was only experience, and experience had usually been paid for with several generations of mistakes. After the autumn harvest, farmers did not immediately throw all the grain together. Instead, they examined it with remarkable patience. Bundles from healthier sections of the fields were separated from weaker ones. Heads of rice that had matured evenly were set aside. Plants that resisted disease or survived unusually heavy rains earned careful attention. Families remembered which corners of the terrace flooded first, which patches dried too quickly, which slopes received more morning sunlight. The landscape itself became a giant notebook. Nobody wrote it down. They simply remembered. Memory, before modern record-keeping, was one of humanity's greatest technologies. An elderly grandmother might quietly point toward one basket. Those came from the upper terrace. Her son nodded. They survived the late frost. Another farmer might shake his head while examining a different bundle. Too many empty grains. Without another word, those would become dinner instead of next year's hope. Harsh, perhaps, but practical. Ancient farming rewarded honesty far more generously than optimism. The best seeds were chosen from the strongest plants, not necessarily the biggest, but the healthiest. A stalk standing proudly after weeks of heavy rain often mattered more than one that simply looked impressive for a few sunny days. Nature has always been suspicious of shortcuts. Sometimes the toughest plants appeared almost ordinary. Farmers learned to appreciate quiet strength, rather like history itself. The people who quietly kept entire civilizations alive rarely received statues. Meanwhile, someone who won one battle while wearing an unusually shiny helmet could expect generations of admiration. History has an interesting definition of celebrity. In ancient China, this careful selection became increasingly sophisticated over centuries. Agricultural manuals from later dynasties describe methods for choosing full, heavy grains and rejecting damaged or immature ones. Experienced farmers often soaked harvested rice in water, noticing which grains sank quickly. Healthy, dense seeds usually settled to the bottom. Empty or poorly developed grains floated. Even without understanding genetics, they understood results. The water did the sorting. Nature quietly revealed her preferences. Across Japan, mountain villages developed their own local varieties. Some matured early, before cooler autumn weather arrived. Others tolerated colder nights at higher elevations. Still others survived periods of heavy rainfall that would destroy more delicate strains. Entire communities gradually shaped their rice through centuries of careful observation. No scientific conference announced these improvements. No medals were awarded. Just patient families making thoughtful choices every harvest, generation after generation. In Korea, similar traditions flourished. Farming families protected seed grain almost as carefully as family heirlooms. It represented survival. During difficult winters, when food supplies grew dangerously low, seed rice was often the last reserve anyone wanted to touch. Imagine opening a storage jar while your stomach growled with hunger. Inside sat enough grain to ease today's suffering, but eating it might mean having nothing to plant next spring. Few decisions demanded greater discipline. Many families endured extraordinary hardship simply to protect those precious seeds. Their future literally rested inside woven baskets. Children learned very early that certain containers were not ordinary food stores. Parents pointed toward them with unusual seriousness. This is for spring, not tomorrow, not next week. Spring. Even the youngest understood. Touching those baskets without permission invited consequences considerably more memorable than bedtime without dessert. Storage itself became an art. Rice seed had to remain dry. Too much moisture encouraged mold. Too little care attracted insects. Rodents regarded grain stores as magnificent personal buffets. The farmers, understandably, disagreed. Granaries were often raised above the ground on wooden posts. Some included smooth stone discs beneath each support to discourage rats from climbing upward. It wasn't perfect. Rats possess astonishing confidence, but every obstacle helped. Cats earned their keep with remarkable enthusiasm, at least when they weren't occupied with lengthy afternoon naps, which, to be fair, they considered equally important work. Throughout East and Southeast Asia, farmers experimented with countless ways to protect their precious seed. Clay jars sealed against humidity, woven bamboo containers suspended from roof beams, wooden chests lined with straw, ash sprinkled around storage areas to discourage insects, smoke from household fires slowly drifting through rafters, helping preserve stored grain. Simple techniques, ingenious results, each represented generations of trial and error. Someone, somewhere, had probably learned every lesson the difficult way. One spring too wet, one storage room too warm, one forgotten crack that invited hungry mice. History rarely records those small failures, yet every successful tradition usually began as somebody's unfortunate mistake. Long before sunrise on planting day, one respected elder opened the village seed store. He did not rush. There was no reason to. He untied the straw rope, securing the lid, lifted it carefully, and inhaled deeply. Healthy seed had a distinctive smell, clean, dry, fresh, not sour, not damp, not musty. Experienced farmers trusted their noses almost as much as their eyes. The aroma drifting upward told him everything he hoped to hear. Nearby stood his granddaughter, perhaps 8 years old. She watched every movement without speaking. The old man noticed. Without saying a word, he handed her a handful of rice. She rolled the grains gently between her fingers. Some slipped through her tiny hands back into the basket. Others remained in her palm. "This one?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "Look closely." She held the grain toward the morning light. It was plump, smooth, golden, whole, not cracked, not discolored, not shriveled. Tiny details, enormous importance. Years later, she would teach another child exactly the same lesson. Not from a book, from memory. Knowledge traveled through families, much the same way rivers traveled through terraces. Steadily, patiently, always moving forward. In many villages, selecting seed also carried symbolic meaning. The finest grain represented gratitude for the previous harvest and confidence in the next. Some families placed small offerings beside the seed baskets before planting season. Others spoke quiet prayers, asking that each grain multiply into thousands more. These rituals were not merely superstition. They reflected an understanding that farming depended upon forces no human fully controlled. Skill mattered enormously. So did weather. So did luck. Even the greatest farmer could not negotiate with a typhoon. Many undoubtedly wished they could. As dawn brightened across the mountain, women began carrying carefully measured baskets of seedling bundles toward the flooded terraces. Every bright green shoot growing inside those bundles could trace its history backward through countless seasons of careful selection. Its ancestors had survived storms, floods, cold nights, hungry birds, unexpected droughts, the quiet judgment of generations. That little seedling represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Remarkable, really. When we look across a rice terrace today, we often admire the reflection of mountains in the water. Beautiful as they are, the real miracle is much smaller. It fits comfortably in the palm of your hand. One grain, chosen with care, protected through winter, carried across generations, capable of feeding a family, sustaining a village, supporting an empire, and quietly shaping the history of half the world. The farmers gathering in the morning light probably never imagined that thousands of years later, people on the other side of the planet would still be fascinated by the quiet choices they made. To them, it was simply another spring, another planting season, another careful beginning. Yet those ordinary mornings, repeated year after year, became the foundation upon which entire civilizations quietly flourished. And now, with the seed chosen, protected, and transformed into delicate green seedlings, there remained one final challenge before planting could truly begin. The fields themselves had to be prepared, every terrace flooded, every wall inspected, every inch of mud made ready to welcome the next generation of rice. The next chapter, preparing the nursery beds, follows the painstaking work of raising young rice seedlings and transforming them into the vibrant green carpets that would soon be transplanted across the flooded mountain terraces. Part 4. Preparing the nursery. Beds long before thousands of hands stepped into the flooded terraces, long before neat rows of bright green seedlings stretched across the mountainsides, and long before entire villages gathered beneath the couloir. skies of early spring. Another, quieter chapter had already unfolded. It began with a patch of earth, no larger than a modest garden. If the towering rice terraces were the grand stage of the farming year, then the nursery beds were the backstage workshop where every future harvest quietly began. There were no cheering crowds, no village festivals, no officials arriving to congratulate anyone. Only a handful of experienced farmers kneeling in damp soil, carefully preparing a place where life could begin. History often celebrates the dramatic moments. The nursery beds remind us that civilizations usually start with people doing very ordinary jobs remarkably well. Several weeks before transplanting season, while winter still lingered over the mountains, the village elders walked slowly through the lower terraces, searching for the perfect location. Not every patch of land would do. The soil needed to be rich, but soft. Water had to flow gently, never rushing hard enough to wash away tiny seeds. Morning sunlight was welcomed, while harsh afternoon winds were not. Protection mattered almost as much as fertility. Young rice seedlings were surprisingly delicate, strong enough to feed kingdoms someday, fragile enough to lose a battle against one particularly enthusiastic duck. Nature has always possessed an impressive sense of irony. One elderly farmer stopped beside a narrow stream. He crouched silently, scooped up a handful of dark soil, and rubbed it between his fingers. It crumbled smoothly. No large stones, no stubborn clay lumps, just fine, fertile earth carrying the faint scent of moisture and decaying leaves. He smiled. This will do. No committee meeting followed. No lengthy debate. Thousands of years of experience had taught him what healthy soil felt like. His hands knew long before words became necessary. Soon the village came together to prepare the nursery beds. Men loosened the ground with wooden spades tipped with iron where available. Others broke apart stubborn clumps, using simple hose worn smooth by generations of use. Women followed behind, gathering roots, pebbles, and bits of old vegetation that might interfere with the tiny seedlings. Children collected stones in woven baskets, proudly believing they were performing the most important task in the world. To be fair, every stone removed was one less obstacle waiting for a tender root. History occasionally rewards enthusiasm after all. The nursery plots were deliberately smaller than the great terraces climbing the mountainside, managing thousands of young plants in one compact area made watering easier. It also allowed farmers to protect them more carefully during their earliest days. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a nursery, only instead of colorful walls and soft blankets, it featured mud, bamboo fences, and an alarming number of frogs. The frogs, fortunately, were welcome guests. They happily consumed insects that might otherwise feast upon the tender shoots. Ancient farmers may not have used the phrase biological pest control, but they certainly appreciated hard-working amphibians. One imagines the frogs considered it simply another productive day at work. Once the soil had been loosened, it was carefully leveled. This demanded remarkable patience. Even slight differences in height could cause water to collect unevenly. Too much standing water might rot the seeds. Too little moisture could dry them before they germinated. Every inch mattered. Standing at the edge of the nursery, one young boy asked his grandfather why they spent so much time making the ground perfectly flat. The old man smiled without looking up from his work. Because water is lazy, the boy frowned. What do you mean? It always looks for the easiest path. He poured a small bowl of water onto the soil. The water immediately rushed toward one lower corner. See, the grandfather chuckled. If we are careless today, the water will spend the entire spring reminding us. It was a lesson in farming. It was also, perhaps, a lesson about life. Nature has remarkable patience. She notices every shortcut. As the beds took shape, irrigation channels were opened. Crystal clear mountain water slipped quietly into the prepared plots. Not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to moisten the earth. Farmers adjusted tiny earthen ridges with their hands, guiding the flow as carefully as an artist applying the first brushstrokes to a painting. Watching experienced farmers manage water was almost mesmerizing. A small handful of mud placed here, a slight opening carved there. Within minutes, the entire nursery settled into perfect balance. Modern engineers might admire the elegance. Ancient farmers simply called it Tuesday. Across China, similar nursery beds appeared each spring. Records from later dynasties describe villages preparing carefully measured seed plots weeks before transplanting began. Agricultural scholars wrote detailed instructions on soil preparation, drainage, and watering. Though experienced farmers often smiled politely at official advice, after all, many government officials had spent considerably more time holding brushes than hoes. It's easy to explain farming from behind a comfortable desk. Convincing stubborn mud to cooperate is another matter entirely. Japan's mountain villages developed their own careful techniques. Because land was limited, every small nursery bed had to produce as many healthy seedlings as possible. Families worked with astonishing precision. Nothing was wasted. Not space, not water, not effort. Even fallen leaves collected during winter sometimes returned to the soil as natural fertilizer. The mountain gave. The farmers borrowed. Then they quietly gave back. In Korea, communities often helped one another prepare nursery plots. Neighbors exchanged labor because everyone understood a simple truth. One family's successful harvest strengthened the whole village. If disaster struck one household, others might share grain during winter. Cooperation wasn't merely kindness. It was survival, wearing a friendly face. As the nursery beds became ready, another important task began: protecting them. Simple fences woven from bamboo surrounded many plots. Their purpose was not to stop thieves. Very few people wished to steal seeds that still needed months of exhausting work before becoming edible. The real troublemakers had feathers or fur. Hungry birds viewed freshly planted seed as an irresistible invitation. Small deer occasionally wandered too close. Wild boars possessed an extraordinary talent for ruining weeks of careful work in a single enthusiastic evening. Farmers, understandably, held mixed opinions regarding wildlife. Beautiful from a distance, less charming, while standing in the middle of your future dinner. Children often took turns watching the nursery beds. Armed with little more than sticks, rattles made from dried gourds, and endless determination, they chased away flocks of sparrows throughout the day. Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly. Sometimes the birds simply waited until lunchtime. The contest continued every spring. Neither side ever admitted defeat. Once everything was prepared, the long-awaited moment arrived. The carefully selected seed was carried from storage, not in grand procession, not accompanied by music, just quiet footsteps across damp earth. Each basket represented months of planning and generations of accumulated wisdom. An elderly woman reached into the basket and held a handful of grain close to her chest. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. Perhaps she whispered a prayer. Perhaps she simply remembered previous springs, her parents, her grandparents, the countless mornings that had led to this one. Then, with slow, practiced movements, she scattered the first seeds across the prepared nursery bed. Others followed. Their hands moved with remarkable consistency, spreading the grain evenly so that every seed would have room to sprout. Watching them was almost hypnotic. A gentle sweep of the arm, a quiet step forward, another handful, another careful throw, again and again. Soon the dark earth disappeared beneath thousands of tiny grains, waiting patiently beneath a thin covering of soil. The nursery looked almost unchanged. Nothing dramatic had happened. No bright green shoots appeared instantly. Nature has never been especially interested in dramatic entrances. She prefers patience. The farmers knew this. They returned home, trusting the days ahead to do their quiet work. Morning sunlight, cool nights, gentle rain, flowing water, warm soil. Together, they would accomplish what no human hands could force. Within days, the first pale green shoots would emerge. Within weeks, the nursery would transform into a dense carpet of emerald life. Standing there, one might easily mistake it for ordinary grass. The farmers knew better. Every blade carried a promise. Every tiny stem represented bowls of rice not yet cooked, festivals not yet celebrated, taxes not yet paid, children not yet fed. So much hope hidden inside something so small. It is one of history's quieter miracles. Empires often rose through conquest, diplomacy, or trade. But before any of those could happen, somewhere in a humble nursery bed tucked beside a mountain stream, someone had patiently prepared the soil, scattered a handful of rice seed, and trusted spring to do the rest. The nursery now rested beneath the gentle care of the season. Soon, the tiny shoots would grow strong enough to leave their protected beds behind. Ahead lay the flooded terraces, where thousands of waiting hands would begin the slow, rhythmic work, and that defined the heart of spring itself, transplanting each delicate seedling, one by one, into the shining fields that climbed toward the clouds. In the next chapter, Flooding the Ancient Terraces, we'll explore the astonishing engineering behind mountain rice terraces and the generations of labor required to fill each field with perfectly controlled water before a single seedling could be planted. Part 5, Flooding the Ancient Terraces. If you had wandered into one of these mountain valleys just a few weeks earlier, you might have wondered whether the villagers had collectively lost their minds. Instead of trying to keep water away from their fields, as farmers in many other parts of the world desperately attempted, they were doing everything possible to flood them, deliberately, carefully, methodically. To an outsider, it must have looked wonderfully confusing. Imagine spending months building beautiful fields, only to fill them with water until they resembled hundreds of small ponds. History occasionally asks us to trust the process. Rice farming asks us to trust it while standing ankle-deep in mud. The truth, however, was beautifully simple. Rice loves water, not because the plant enjoys making life difficult for anyone planting it, although one suspects it, occasionally takes quiet satisfaction in the arrangement, but because flooded fields create an environment where rice thrives while many troublesome weeds struggle to survive. The water became an ally. It nourished the young plants, softened the soil, discouraged competing vegetation, and helped regulate temperature during the unpredictable weeks of early spring. It was one of humanity's oldest and most successful partnerships with nature. But none of it happened by accident. Every flooded terrace represented centuries of engineering knowledge, patient observation, and relentless maintenance. Standing at the foot of a mountain terrace today, it's easy to admire its beauty. Rows upon rows of shimmering water climb the hillside like giant mirrors reflecting the sky. Photographers travel across the world, hoping to capture that perfect sunrise when golden light dances across every flooded step. It's breathtaking. What the photographs rarely show is the thousands of hours required to keep those mirrors from collapsing into the valley below. Gravity, after all, has never been especially cooperative. Long before planting season arrived, villagers inspected every retaining wall. These walls were the backbone of the terraces, built from carefully stacked stone, packed earth, or sometimes both. They held back enormous amounts of soil and water. A single weak section could fail without warning, and when one terrace collapsed, it often dragged several others with it. Mountains possess a rather unfortunate talent for encouraging things to roll downhill. An elderly mason slowly walked along one stone wall, tapping individual rocks with a short wooden mallet. Tock, tock, tock. Most produced a solid sound. One gave a dull, hollow thud. He stopped immediately. Without saying a word, he crouched beside the wall and gently pulled away loose soil. A stone had shifted during winter, not dramatically, just enough. Enough was all it took. Within minutes, neighbors joined him. No one complained. No one asked whether it could wait until tomorrow. Everyone understood. Repairing one loose stone today might prevent losing an entire harvest 6 months later. Some investments pay astonishingly generous dividends. The work was slow. Individual stones were lifted by hand. Fresh earth packed carefully behind them. Smaller rocks wedged into tiny gaps. Every movement demanded patience. A hurried repair often failed before summer arrived. The mountain rewarded careful craftsmanship. She punished carelessness without much discussion. Nearby, another group cleared the irrigation channels. Throughout winter, leaves had drifted into narrow ditches. Small branches blocked sections of the flow. Mud settled where the water had slowed. Tiny plants had begun growing in unexpected places. Nature, it seemed, had been quietly redecorating. The farmers politely returned everything to its proper arrangement. Using wooden shovels and simple hoes, they removed debris from the channels. Children followed behind with woven baskets, carrying away leaves and stones. Even the smallest members of the village found ways to contribute. One little girl proudly carried 3 pebbles to the edge of the field. Her father smiled as though She had personally engineered the entire irrigation system. Perhaps, in that moment, she had. History is often built upon encouragement as much as achievement. As the channels opened, mountain water began its gentle journey. High above the village, streams born from melting snow wound their way through forests of pine and cedar. Some villages relied on natural springs, bubbling quietly from rocky hillsides. Others diverted small rivers, using hand-built canals. The source varied. The principle remained the same. Water must move, slowly, steadily, predictably. Farmers adjusted simple wooden gates that controlled its flow. Lift one board, and water slipped into the uppermost terrace. Close another, and it waited patiently inside a holding channel. The system looked almost effortless. It wasn't. Every gate reflected generations of experimentation. Someone, centuries earlier, had discovered exactly how much water should enter each field. Too much, and the retaining walls might weaken. Too little, and the soil remained too firm for planting. Nature appreciates precision more than enthusiasm. One experienced farmer stood quietly watching the first terrace fill. He didn't stare at the water itself. He watched its surface. Small ripples moved toward one corner. The flow slowed slightly near another. A tiny whirlpool appeared beside an earthen ridge. Without hesitation, he stepped into the shallow water and pressed a little mud against one edge. The whirlpool vanished. Problem solved. It was such a small adjustment that most people would never have noticed. Yet hundreds of similar corrections made the entire system work. Mastery often looks invisible. Across ancient China, irrigation became one of the greatest achievements of agricultural civilization. Large canals carried water across vast plains, while mountain communities developed intricate networks of smaller channels feeding countless terraces. Officials occasionally sponsored ambitious engineering projects, but maintaining them depended almost entirely on ordinary villagers. Governments could announce grand plans. Someone still had to remove the mud. History has always required volunteers. In Japan, particularly in mountainous regions, water rights became extraordinarily important. Entire communities established careful schedules determining exactly when each terrace received its share. Families cooperated because everyone understood a simple reality. If one farmer selfishly diverted too much water, neighbors farther downhill might lose theirs altogether. The mountain connected everyone, whether they liked it or not. Disagreements certainly occurred. History would be suspiciously unrealistic otherwise. Arguments over water could become surprisingly passionate, not because people enjoyed quarreling, because water meant survival. Fortunately, many villages developed customs that encouraged compromise before disagreements became disasters. One respected elder might inspect the channels. Another family agreed to repair damaged walls. Someone shared labor instead of grain. Solutions usually arrived through conversation rather than conflict, at least most of the time. Meanwhile, the terraces continued filling, one by one, step by step. From above, the mountainside slowly transformed into an enormous staircase of silver mirrors. Clouds drifted across their surfaces. Birds skimmed low above the water. The first dragonflies returned with warmer weather, darting through the air like tiny blue arrows. Frogs announced their approval with enthusiastic croaking. One suspects they considered flooded rice terraces the finest real estate ever constructed. Buffaloes, however, required closer supervision. Strong, patient, and wonderfully suited to muddy conditions, they were invaluable partners during the farming season, yet they occasionally displayed independent thinking. A young buffalo, noticing a particularly inviting patch of soft mud beside an unfinished terrace, decided to investigate very thoroughly. Within moments, two farmers were gently persuading him that architectural experimentation was not part of today's schedule. The buffalo appeared unconvinced. Fortunately, he was eventually outvoted. By midday, sunlight sparkled across every flooded field. The water reflected brilliant blue skies, broken only by drifting white clouds. Standing between the terraces, it became difficult to tell where the earth ended and the heavens began. Everything shimmered, everything glowed, everything waited. This was the moment many farmers loved most, before the hard work of transplanting truly began, before aching backs and tired legs, before summer heat settled heavily over the valley. The terraces rested in perfect stillness, holding nothing but clear water and limitless possibility. An elderly woman paused on one narrow stone path. She had walked these terraces since childhood. Now her hair had turned silver. Her hands bore the marks of countless seasons. She looked across the flooded mountainside and smiled quietly. Her granddaughter asked why. "They're ready," she answered. Such a simple sentence. Yet behind those two words lay months of preparation. Walls repaired, channels cleared, water guided, soil softened, nature and human effort finally reaching agreement. The terraces were ready, not merely to grow rice, but to continue a tradition stretching back thousands of years. Tomorrow, thousands of tiny green seedlings would leave the safety of their nursery beds. Human hands would carry them into the shining water, one by one, row by row, until every flooded terrace reflected not only the morning sky, but also the quiet determination of generations who understood that the greatest achievements are often built through the smallest repeated actions. As evening settled gently over the mountains, the last rays of sunlight turned the terraces to liquid gold. The villagers walked home along the narrow stone paths, tired but satisfied. Behind them, the water remained perfectly still, patiently waiting for dawn, and with dawn would come the true heart of spring, the slow, rhythmic dance of transplanting rice seedlings, where thousands of careful hands would bend toward the earth, trusting each tiny green shoot with the future of an entire harvest. The next chapter, life of ordinary farming families, will leave the terraces for a while and step inside the humble homes of the men, women, children, and grandparents whose daily lives revolved around the rhythm of the rice-growing year. Part 6. Life of ordinary farming families. As the first flooded terraces shimmered beneath the gentle light of spring, it was easy to believe that rice farming was all about fields, water, mud, seedlings, mountains, beautiful scenery, and aching backs. Mostly aching backs. But the fields were only half the story. The other half unfolded behind simple wooden doors, beneath thatched roofs, beside smoky cooking fires, and around worn family tables where history's greatest agricultural achievement quietly continued every single day. Because rice was never grown by individuals alone, it was grown by families, entire families, grandparents, whose memories stretched back through decades of harvests, parents balancing endless responsibilities, teenagers who secretly wished mornings began a little later, small children who believed carrying one basket made them indispensable members of the workforce. In fairness, they often were. Long before sunrise, while mist still drifted through the valley, the first sounds inside the village were not voices, they were footsteps. Soft, careful, familiar. Someone stirred the embers left, glowing beneath the previous night's ashes. Someone else reached for a clay water jar. Wood creaked as doors opened quietly into the cool morning air. There was no need for alarm clocks. Nature had already invented birds. Whether humanity appreciated their enthusiasm at such unreasonable hours remains open to debate. Inside one modest farmhouse, 3 generations lived beneath the same roof. The building itself was simple. Heavy, wooden beams supported a steep roof designed to shed rain and snow. The walls were woven from bamboo coated with layers of clay. The floor, packed earth in some rooms and polished wood in others, carried the marks of countless footsteps. Nothing inside was extravagant. Nothing needed to be. Near the center of the house burned a small hearth. Its smoke drifted upward through openings in the roof, darkening the beams year after year. Visitors might have noticed the blackened wood. The family noticed something else. That slow-moving smoke helped preserve the timber from insects and gradually dried herbs, ropes, and even stored foods hanging overhead. An ordinary cooking fire quietly performed several jobs at once. Efficiency, it turns out, did not require electricity. The grandmother was usually awake first, not because she slept less, though perhaps she did. Age has an interesting habit of changing one's relationship with mornings. Rather, she understood that a calm beginning often determined the rhythm of the entire day. She measured grain with practiced hands, prepared soup, checked the pickled vegetables stored through winter. If dried fish remained from previous weeks, she inspected them carefully before placing them near the fire. Nothing was wasted, not because thriftiness was fashionable, because survival demanded it. Modern kitchens overflow with choices. Ancient farmhouses often celebrated simply having enough. Nearby, the grandfather sat quietly repairing a woven basket. One strip of bamboo had broken during the previous day's work. Instead of replacing the basket entirely, he patiently removed damaged pieces and wove new ones into place. His fingers moved almost automatically. Each movement reflected decades of practice. The basket would likely serve several more years, perhaps longer. Things built carefully rarely hurry toward retirement. Outside, the family's eldest son prepared the carrying poles. Smooth lengths of bamboo rested across his shoulders as naturally as if they belonged there. Later, they would support heavy bundles of seedlings, baskets of tools, or containers filled with harvested grain. For now, he inspected each pole for tiny cracks. One weak section might snap halfway across a slippery terrace. Mountains possess an unfortunate sense of timing. Meanwhile, His younger sister was responsible for gathering water, balancing two wooden buckets suspended from either end of a shoulder pole demanded remarkable coordination. Watching experienced villagers walk narrow paths while carrying heavy loads looked almost effortless. Trying it yourself would almost certainly produce a memorable lesson in gravity. Some skills simply cannot be rushed. Children began learning them almost as soon as they could walk. By the age of 6 or 7, many already knew how to collect kindling, feed chickens, scare birds from the nursery beds, or carry small bundles of seedlings. Nobody expected perfection. Everyone expected participation. Work was simply another language spoken within the household. Parents rarely needed lengthy lectures about responsibility. The rhythm of village life taught it naturally. Even play reflected the farming year. Children built miniature terraces from mud after rainstorms. They floated tiny leaf boats through irrigation channels. They pretended to transplant grass as though it were rice. Adults smiled knowingly. One day, those games would become real work. For now, imagination made excellent practice. Across ancient China, family remained the foundation of rural society. Confucian ideals emphasized respect between generations, placing great value on filial responsibility. Older family members guided younger ones not only through moral teachings, but also through practical knowledge, how to recognize healthy seedlings, when to open irrigation gates, how to repair terrace walls after heavy rain. Wisdom flowed through households, just as water flowed through mountain channels. Slowly, steadily, continuously. Japan's farming villages followed similar patterns. Several generations often shared one household, especially in mountain communities where land was limited. The eldest family members no longer worked as quickly in the fields. Instead, they became living libraries. They remembered unusual weather, great floods, harsh winters, locust years, exceptional harvests. A grandson might ask whether the spring seemed colder than usual. His grandfather could answer by comparing it to a season 40 years earlier. No written record, just memory. Remarkably reliable memory. History often survived because somebody's grandparents refused to forget. Women carried responsibilities that stretched far beyond cooking. They planted rice, managed household stores, made clothing, collected firewood, cared for children, prepared preserved foods for winter, fed livestock, repaired tools when necessary, helped neighbors during busy seasons, and somehow still found time to comfort frightened children during thunderstorms. Ancient society frequently overlooked their contributions. The fields certainly did not. Without their labor, many villages simply could not have functioned. One young mother tied her infant securely against her back with a wide cloth before walking toward the terraces. The baby slept peacefully, despite every step. Older children skipped ahead carrying small baskets. By the time evening arrived, she would have planted hundreds of seedlings, prepared supper, washed clothing, and probably listened patiently while someone complained about being tired. History has occasionally displayed remarkable confidence, especially when discussing other people's work. As spring progressed, neighbors depended heavily upon one another. Planting thousands of seedlings required more hands than a single family usually possessed. So villages organized cooperative labor. Today, everyone helped one household, tomorrow another, the following day, someone else. No money changed hands. The understanding was simple. Help would be returned. It was an economy built upon trust. Not perfect. Human beings remained delightfully complicated. Occasional disagreements certainly arose. Someone arrived late. Someone worked more slowly. Someone's buffalo developed an inconvenient interest in wandering. Yet cooperation generally prevailed. Because everyone recognized the alternative. Trying to transplant an entire mountainside alone. That prospect discouraged selfishness rather effectively. Evenings brought a different rhythm. Families returned home exhausted. Mud clung stubbornly to legs and clothing. Hands smelled faintly of wet earth and young rice plants. Boots, where they existed, were cleaned carefully. Many simply washed their feet before entering the house. Water warmed over the hearth, soothed aching muscles. Children often fell asleep before finishing supper. Parents exchanged tired smiles across the room. Another day completed. Many more ahead after the meal. Work continued. Clothing required mending. Tools needed sharpening. Ropes had to be repaired. Seedling baskets woven back together. Grandparents told stories while their hands remained busy. Legends of mountain spirits. Old harvest festivals. Memories of years when the terraces glittered with especially abundant grain. The children listened with wide eyes. Whether every detail was historically accurate hardly mattered. Stories carried values as much as facts. Respect the water. Care for the land. Help your neighbors. Be patient. Nature always keeps her own calendar. One rainy evening, as wind rattled the wooden shutters, a little boy asked his grandmother whether rice ever became tired of growing. She laughed softly. No, why not? Because it doesn't spend time worrying. The boy considered this very seriously. So, people worry enough for both? She smiled. That seems about right. Perhaps she understood something philosophers have spent centuries trying to explain. Throughout East and Southeast Asia, countless anonymous families live variations of this same story. Different dialects echoed through their kitchens. Different festivals marked the seasons. Different ancestors watched over different villages. Yet morning fires burned much the same. Children laughed much the same. Grandparents offered familiar advice, and every spring, families walked together toward flooded terraces, carrying the future balanced carefully across their shoulders. History often celebrates emperors who ruled millions, but emperors ate. Because ordinary families woke before dawn. Generals marched because farming households produced food. Cities prospered because mountain villages patiently repeated the same demanding cycle every year. Civilizations rest upon surprisingly humble foundations. A bowl of rice, a repaired basket, a grandmother's memory, a child's first careful step into the mud. As darkness settled over the village once more, lanterns flickered gently behind paper windows. The mountains grew quiet. Only the soft sound of flowing irrigation channels continued through the night, carrying tomorrow's water toward tomorrow's work. Inside every farmhouse, tired families drifted toward sleep, knowing that dawn would arrive sooner than anyone preferred. It always did, and when it came, thousands of hands would once again bend toward the shining terraces, beginning the slow, graceful rhythm that defined the heart of spring, transplanting each delicate seedling into the waiting fields, one careful movement after another. The next chapter, the exhausting art of hand transplanting, will follow the workers into the flooded terraces, exploring the extraordinary precision, endurance, and quiet teamwork required to plant thousands of rice seedlings entirely by hand. Part 7. The exhausting art of hand transplanting. The real work began the moment everyone stepped into the water. Everything before this, the careful choice of seed, the patient preparation of nursery beds, the repair of terrace walls, the slow filling of irrigation channels, the quiet organization of families and neighbors, had all been leading to this single task, transplanting. It sounds almost gentle, a neat little word, something that could probably be accomplished during a pleasant afternoon with a few gardening gloves and perhaps a cheerful bird singing nearby. History, as usual, has omitted several important details. Those details include endless mud, aching muscles, cold water, blistered hands, sore knees, sunburned necks, and enough bending to make your spine question every life decision that brought it to this mountain. The villagers, however, didn't complain very much, not because the work was easy, because complaining rarely planted rice any faster. As dawn spread across the terraces, dozens of workers gathered along the narrow earthen paths, separating one flooded field from another. Each person carried several bundles of young seedlings, tied loosely with strands of rice straw. The seedlings were brilliantly green, almost glowing against the dark brown mud beneath the clear water. They looked surprisingly delicate, and they were. A heavy step could crush them. A rough grip could damage their roots. Too much time out of the water could dry them. Each tiny plant demanded careful treatment from beginning to end. One experienced farmer lifted a bundle and gently separated it into smaller groups. He didn't count each plant individually. He didn't need to. After decades of practice, his fingers seemed to know exactly how many seedlings belonged in each handful. 3, sometimes 4, occasionally 2, depending on the variety and local custom. Not too many, not too few. Enough to give the future plant strength without forcing it to compete with its neighbors. Balance. Rice farming always seemed to return to balance. Nearby, his granddaughter watched closely. She reached for a handful of seedlings, only to grab far too many. The old man smiled. No hurry. She tried again. This time she selected only a few slender shoots. He nodded. Better. She grinned proudly. One day she would perform the same motion thousands of times. Without thinking, every master begins by dropping a few seedlings into the mud. The terraces soon filled with quiet movement. Workers spread themselves into long lines stretching across the shallow water. Some villages planted side by side. Others worked in staggered rows. The arrangement mattered less than the rhythm, because rhythm turned impossible labor into manageable labor. One step backward, one bend. Push the roots gently into the soft mud. Release. Straighten slightly. Another small step. Repeat. Again, and again, and again. Thousands of times. From a distance, the line of workers moved almost like a single living creature. Everyone advanced at nearly the same pace. Nobody hurried too far ahead. Nobody lingered too far behind. The mountain watched patiently while human determination slowly covered every terrace with neat rows of green. The mud naturally had opinions of its own. With each step, feet sank several inches beneath the surface, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes nearly to the knees. Lifting a foot required surprising effort. The mud clung stubbornly, apparently convinced every visitor should remain permanently. One young boy attempted to take a large step. His foot stayed exactly where it was. The rest of him continued forward. The result was immediate. Splash. He landed squarely in the water. For a moment, complete silence. Then his older sister laughed. Soon everyone nearby was smiling, even the boy. There were only so many ways to preserve one's dignity. While wearing half the terrace, the mud accepted another victory. Experienced workers learned not to fight it. Short, careful steps conserved energy. Large movements only invited trouble. Ancient farmers may never have studied biomechanics, but their backs certainly conducted extensive field research. Hours passed, almost unnoticed. The steady repetition created a curious kind of meditation. Hands reached. Roots entered the mud. Water rippled. Birds called overhead. Someone quietly hummed an old planting song. Another worker joined in. Before long, several voices carried gently across the terraces. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough to keep everyone moving together. Across East Asia, planting songs formed an important part of rural life. In Japan, many villages sang tawe uta, songs specifically associated with transplanting rice. Their melodies helped coordinate movement and lighten the endless repetition. In Korea, similar work songs echoed across valleys during the busiest agricultural seasons. Chinese farming communities also developed regional songs that blended practical rhythm with local folklore. Music could not eliminate exhaustion. It simply made friendship louder than fatigue. One elderly woman sang with surprising strength. Her granddaughter asked how she still remembered every verse. The old woman chuckled. When you've planted rice for 60 springs, the songs start remembering you. Perhaps she was joking, perhaps not. Some traditions become so deeply woven into daily life that they seem almost alive. As the sun climbed higher, reflections danced across the flooded terraces. Bright light bounced from the water into tired faces. Straw hats became essential. Broad, woven from bamboo or rice straw, they shaded necks and shoulders while allowing air to circulate. Fashion was not their purpose. Survival looked remarkably stylish on its own. The heat gradually intensified. Morning chill gave way to warm sunshine. Tiny beads of sweat formed despite standing in cool water. Mosquitoes began appearing. With admirable punctuality, dragonflies darted above the fields, hunting insects. Frogs continued their endless chorus, as though supervising the entire operation. Somewhere in the distance, a water buffalo snorted loudly. No one paid much attention. Buffaloes have always enjoyed announcing their presence. The planting itself demanded astonishing precision. Each seedling needed enough space to grow. Too close together, and the plants competed for sunlight and nutrients. Too far apart, and valuable land remained unused. Experienced farmers judged distances almost instinctively. Some used ropes marked with knots. Others relied entirely upon memory. Row after row appeared astonishingly straight. Not perfectly straight. Human beings are involved after all, but close enough to make later work far easier. Modern visitors often admire ancient terraces for their beauty. The farmers admired them because straight rows made weeding considerably less miserable. Practicality occasionally produces elegance. By midday, backs began protesting. Standing upright after hours of bending became an event worthy of quiet celebration. Workers stretched slowly. Hands rested briefly on aching hips. Someone passed around water, stored in earthen jars, kept cool beneath damp cloth. Lunch was simple: rice from the previous harvest, pickled vegetables, perhaps dried fish, maybe a little bean paste. No elaborate feast, no lengthy break, just enough nourishment to continue. Food tasted unusually satisfying after several hours in the terraces. Hard work has always been an excellent cook. Children carried fresh bundles of seedlings from the nursery beds throughout the afternoon. They skipped along narrow paths with remarkable confidence. Visitors usually walked far more cautiously. One careless step could send a person sliding into the nearest flooded field. History offers many opportunities for embarrassment. Rice terraces provide some of the wettest. An elderly farmer noticed his grandson rushing. There is no prize for finishing first. The boy slowed. But I want to help. You are helping. The old man pointed toward the seedlings. They've waited weeks to come here. He smiled gently. They can wait one more careful step. It was another lesson, hidden inside ordinary conversation. Patience was never separate from farming. It was farming. Across the centuries, millions of anonymous hands repeated this same quiet choreography. During China's Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties, during Japan's Heian, Kamakura, Muromachi, and Edo periods throughout the kingdoms of Korea, across the mountain valleys of Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond, spring meant bending toward the earth. Again and again, empires rose and fell, borders shifted, kings inherited crowns, generals won battles. Yet every year, ordinary people quietly stepped into flooded terraces and planted the food that kept those civilizations alive. History often applauds those standing on palace balconies. It rarely notices the people standing knee-deep in mud. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, something remarkable became visible. The once empty terrace had transformed completely. Where only muddy water had shimmered that morning, thousands of tiny green seedlings now stood in careful rows, stretching from one stone wall to the next. Each one reflected faintly in the clear water. Together they resembled a delicate green tapestry woven across the mountainside. The workers paused, not for long, just long enough to admire what many hands had accomplished. Together, no single person could claim credit. That was precisely the point. Rice farming had always been a shared promise. One family alone might struggle. An entire village could move mountains, or at least persuade them to grow dinner. As the first evening breeze drifted through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine forests, the planters slowly climbed out of the terraces. Mud clung stubbornly to their legs. Their shoulders ached. Their fingers were wrinkled from hours beneath the water. Their backs would undoubtedly remind them of today's efforts tomorrow morning, probably before sunrise. The back, much like the rooster, has impeccable timing. Behind them, the newly planted seedlings swayed almost imperceptibly beneath the gentle current flowing through the terraces. They looked fragile, almost insignificant. Yet every one of those tiny plants carried the possibility of hundreds of grains, enough grain to feed children, support villages, pay taxes, supply armies, celebrate festivals, and sustain civilizations, all because someone had patiently bent over, reached into the mud, and planted one small seedling exactly where it belonged. Tomorrow, they would return to do it all again. The next chapter, Women, Children, and Village Labor, explores how every member of the community, from elderly grandparents to the youngest children, played an essential role in making the rice planting season a success. Part 8, Women, Children, and Village Labor. By the second or third day of transplanting, something became impossible to ignore. No single person could grow enough rice alone. Not the strongest farmer, not the wisest elder, not even the village headman, despite occasionally speaking with the confidence of someone who believed mountains might rearrange themselves. If asked politely enough, rice farming was never the story of one remarkable individual. It was the story of hundreds of ordinary people whose efforts fit together so naturally that history often forgot to notice them. Look across a terrace during the busiest weeks of early spring, and your eyes might first settle on the long lines of adults planting seedlings. But if you looked a little longer, you would begin to notice the quieter movements happening all around them. An elderly woman straightening bundles of seedlings beside the water. A young boy carrying drinking water from a nearby spring. A teenage girl balancing baskets across a narrow stone path with a confidence earned through years of practice. Two small children chasing hungry sparrows from the nursery beds with little more than laughter and a pair of bamboo rattles. A grandfather patiently repairing a broken tool. Beneath the shade of a pine tree, every movement mattered. Every person mattered. The village itself became a single, living machine. Fortunately, one powered by cooperation rather than complicated instruction manuals. Inside most farming households, work had never been divided into neat categories. There was no official schedule pinned to a wall, no supervisor carrying a clipboard, no whistle announcing the beginning or end of each shift. There was simply an understanding that if something needed doing, someone would do it, usually before anyone had the chance to complain. Women carried an astonishing share of that responsibility. At dawn, many had already prepared breakfast before setting foot in the fields. The cooking fire was lit. Water had been boiled. Children had been fed. Elderly relatives checked on. Food packed for the long hours ahead. Only then did they join everyone else in the flooded terraces. There, they planted rice with the same steady rhythm as the men beside them, often faster, though village etiquette usually discouraged anyone from mentioning that fact too loudly. History has occasionally been rather generous toward confident speeches, and surprisingly quiet about competent women. The rice fields, however, kept far more accurate records. An experienced woman could separate bundles of seedlings with extraordinary speed. Her fingers moved almost effortlessly. 3. Seedlings. 4. Plant, step, repeat. The motion flowed like water. Years of repetition had transformed labor into graceful precision. Traveler unfamiliar with rice cultivation might have mistaken it for an elegant dance. They would likely change their opinion after trying it for 15 minutes. Nearby, another woman worked with her infant secured against her back by a long woven cloth. The baby slept peacefully, rocked by every careful movement. Every so often, she paused, adjusted the cloth, smiled softly, and continued planting. The scene must have repeated itself across countless generations. Children, quite literally, grew up in the rice fields. Their earliest memories were often filled with the sounds of flowing water, croaking frogs, singing birds, and the gentle conversations of adults working side by side. For them, the terraces were not picturesque landscapes. They were home. As children grew older, their responsibilities increased naturally. No grand ceremony announced the change. One spring, they were simply trusted with a new task. Perhaps carrying lunch to the workers, perhaps watching younger brothers and sisters, perhaps guarding the nursery beds from hungry birds. Each new responsibility quietly declared, "You are becoming part of this." One little boy, no older than 7, marched proudly along the terrace wall, carrying a small bamboo bucket. The bucket wasn't especially heavy. In fact, his father had deliberately filled it only halfway. Still, the boy held himself with enormous determination. Halfway across the narrow path, he stumbled. The bucket tipped. A little water spilled. He froze, certain he had ruined everything. His father walked over, looked at the bucket, then looked at his son. "Did you fall into the terrace?" The boy shook his head. "No." "Did you lose all the water?" Another shake. "No." His father smiled. "Then you've done better than I did at your age." The boy's worried face slowly transformed into a grin. Sometimes confidence grows one encouraging sentence at a time. Girls learned equally valuable skills. Many accompanied mothers and grandmothers into the fields from an early age. They watched how seedlings were held, how spacing was judged, how irrigation channels were inspected, how weather was discussed. Knowledge was rarely delivered as a formal lesson. It was absorbed through observation. Question asked while walking home. An explanation offered during supper. Demonstration repeated every spring until it became second. Nature education existed long before classrooms. It simply happened outdoors. Across ancient China, family labor formed the heart of agricultural life. Confucian traditions emphasized cooperation, respect between generations, and shared responsibility. The household functioned as both home and workplace. Children learned practical skills not because someone announced a lesson plan, but because daily survival required participation. The classroom had muddy floors. Its textbooks grew from the earth. In Japan, village communities often organized collective planting days, known in later centuries for their remarkable cooperation. Neighbors worked together from one field to the next, ensuring every household finished before the brief planting season ended. Even wealthy landowners depended upon coordinated labor. Rice simply refused to follow individual schedules. Nature had already prepared one of her own. Throughout Korea and many regions of Southeast Asia, communal labor remained equally important. Families exchanged work instead of wages. Today, everyone helped one household. Tomorrow, another. The understanding needed no signature. Trust served as the contract. Breaking that trust carried consequences no village wished to experience. An unreliable neighbor during planting season was remembered long after harvest. Fortunately, kindness was equally memorable. Elderly villagers, though no longer able to spend entire days bent over in flooded terraces, remained indispensable. One grandfather sharpened planting tools on a smooth whetstone. Another repaired woven baskets. An elderly woman sorted seedlings, removing damaged ones before they reached the fields. Others watched toddlers too young to join the work. Age had not ended their contribution. It had simply changed its form. There was wisdom in knowing when to plant. There was equal wisdom in knowing which young worker desperately needed a few moments to rest. Around midday, the terraces became unexpectedly lively. Lunch arrived. Children carried wooden boxes filled with rice, vegetables, preserved radish, bean paste, and sometimes small portions of fish if the family had been fortunate. Workers climbed carefully onto the terrace walls, washed mud from their hands, and sat together beneath whatever shade they could find. Conversation returned. Someone joked about the stubborn buffalo who had once again mistaken a nursery bed for a personal playground. Another laughed about slipping into the mud that morning. An elderly woman insisted the younger generation had become softer. The younger generation politely suggested that perhaps memories become stronger as knees become weaker. Even she laughed. History rarely records laughter, which is unfortunate. It probably happened far more often than we imagine. After the short meal, everyone returned to work. There was little ceremony, no dramatic speeches. One by one, people simply stood, stretched aching backs, picked up fresh bundles of seedlings, and stepped quietly into the water again. Watching them from above would have revealed something remarkable. The village moved almost like a living organism. Children carried supplies. Adults planted. Elders advised. Neighbors shared labor. No movement seemed wasted. Every task connected naturally to another. Even those unable to work in the fields found ways to contribute. One elderly widow spent the afternoon weaving straw sandals. Another prepared herbal remedies for sore muscles and blistered hands. A local craftsman repaired broken hoe handles before dawn, so workers would not lose valuable daylight. The village blacksmith sharpened iron blades, while smoke curled steadily from his forge. He rarely planted rice himself during those weeks. Instead, he ensured everyone else possessed tools capable of doing so. History often asks, who built civilizations? The answer, more often than not, is everyone. Not one hero, not one ruler, not one famous general. Everyone. As afternoon sunlight softened, a little girl sat beside her grandmother at the edge of a terrace. The older woman carefully untangled a bundle of seedlings while the child watched. "Why do we always help everyone else?" the girl asked. Her grandmother looked across the valley where dozens of neighbors worked together. Then she smiled, because one day she pointed toward the mountains. The rain may fall too hard. She pointed toward the sky, or not enough. Finally, she gently touched the little girl's shoulder. And when that day comes, we hope they'll remember helping us today. The child nodded thoughtfully. It was a simple lesson, perhaps one of the oldest in human history. Generosity was never only about kindness. Sometimes it was the strongest form of insurance a farming village could possess. As evening approached, the workers slowly climbed from the flooded terraces once again. Mud covered their legs. Water dripped from their clothing. Their hands bore tiny scratches from roots, stones, and endless repetition. Yet behind them stretched row upon row of perfectly planted rice seedlings, glowing softly beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Each row represented hundreds of careful hands. Each terrace reflected not only the evening sky, but also the quiet strength of an entire community. Civilizations are often remembered through monuments of stone, but perhaps their greatest monuments were built from cooperation instead, not carved into mountains, simply planted across them, one seedling at a time. Tomorrow, the work would continue. The terraces would once again fill with laughter, songs, careful footsteps, and patient hands, because spring waited for no one, and neither did the rice. The next chapter, Songs That Kept the Rhythm, explores the beautiful planting songs, chants, and musical traditions that helped generations of rice farmers transform exhausting labor into a shared rhythm echoing across the mountain valleys. Part 9, Songs That Kept the Rhythm. By the fourth or fifth day of planting, something curious happened to the workers. Not physically. Physically, everyone was exactly as tired as you would expect after spending several days bending over in cold water while repeatedly arguing with gravity and mud. No, the change happened somewhere quieter. The endless rhythm of the work began to settle into the mind. The body no longer needed to think about every movement. Hands reached almost automatically. Feet found firm places beneath the muddy water. Bundles of seedlings grew lighter as rows of green slowly spread across the terraces. The work was still difficult, perhaps impossibly difficult, but it had found its rhythm. And where human beings discover rhythm, they almost always discover music. It probably began very simply. Someone hummed, not because they intended to entertain the village, not because they possessed an extraordinary singing voice. Quite the opposite, in some cases. History has never insisted that hard-working people also perform like professional musicians. Someone simply started humming because silence had become heavier than the work itself. Another worker quietly joined in. A third added a different line. Soon an entire row of farmers was singing together. No rehearsals, no conductor, no printed sheet music, just ordinary people finding a shared heartbeat in the middle of a flooded field. The mountains listened without criticism. Fortunately, one elderly farmer later joked that if the birds had complained about his singing, he would have understood completely. The birds, however, continued their morning chorus as though politely pretending not to notice. Across East Asia, songs became as much a part of rice planting as water itself. Different villages created different melodies. Different valleys remembered different words. Some songs praised a successful harvest. Others asked for gentle rain. Many celebrated cooperation, teased neighbors, or simply counted the steady rhythm of planting. Each reflected the personality of the people who sang them. The terraces became enormous outdoor concert halls. No walls, no stage, only open sky and mountain echoes, carrying familiar voices from one hillside to another. In Japan, these planting songs became known as tawe uta, Some villages preserved them for centuries, passing them from grandparents to grandchildren just as carefully as they passed along farming knowledge. The melodies were often slow and graceful, matching the deliberate movements of transplanting. One singer might call out the opening line. The workers answered together. Call, response, plant, step, repeat. Music became another farming tool, just considerably more pleasant than a shovel. In parts of Korea, farmers sang nongyo, traditional agricultural songs, whose rhythms helped large groups coordinate demanding labor. Some were cheerful, others carried traces of melancholy. Many blended humor with quiet determination. A verse might gently tease someone working too slowly. Another might praise the arrival of spring. Laughter drifted across the terraces as naturally as birdsong. Even exhaustion sounded a little lighter when shared through music. China possessed an equally rich tradition. Across countless provinces, local farming communities developed songs reflecting their own dialects, customs, and landscapes. Mountain villages sang differently from river valleys. Northern melodies differed from southern ones. Yet almost every song shared one purpose: keeping people together, keeping people moving, keeping hope alive. Work songs have always performed a remarkable trick. They cannot make labor easier. They simply make loneliness disappear. One morning, a young boy asked his grandmother why everyone sang the same songs every spring. She smiled while gently pressing another cluster of seedlings into the mud. So nobody forgets. Forgets what? The rhythm. The boy looked confused. The rhythm of planting? She laughed softly. The rhythm of helping each other. Perhaps that was the better answer. Because these songs belonged to everyone, no one claimed ownership. No famous composer signed their name. The melodies changed slightly. Each generation. Verses appeared. Others disappeared. Some lines survived for centuries. Others lasted only a single season. The songs grew the same way villages grew. Naturally, patiently, together. As the morning wore on, one woman began singing a playful verse about an unusually stubborn buffalo. Apparently, the animal had escaped his enclosure the previous year and wandered triumphantly across 3 freshly planted terraces before anyone managed to convince him otherwise. The workers laughed. Someone added another verse, suggesting the buffalo believed himself to be an agricultural inspector. Another claimed he had simply misunderstood the planting instructions. Even the owner laughed hardest of all. History occasionally becomes easier to carry when everyone agrees to find the humor. Children learned these songs almost without realizing it. They listened while carrying baskets. They hummed while chasing birds from the nursery beds. They repeated familiar choruses while helping prepare evening meals. Eventually, they knew every word, long before they understood every meaning. That is often how traditions survive, not through formal lessons, through ordinary days. One elderly woman could no longer spend long hours planting. Her knees objected rather firmly. Instead, she sat beneath a tree overlooking the terraces. As the younger workers sang below, she quietly joined them. Her voice carried surprisingly far. The youngest children turned toward the sound. One whispered, "Grandmother knows all the verses." An older cousin smiled. She probably helped invent half of them. The grandmother overheard and laughed. "I only improved the boring parts." Perhaps she had. Every generation leaves small fingerprints on tradition. The planting songs also carried practical wisdom. Some reminded farmers not to crowd the seedlings. Others warned against rushing. A few mentioned watching the weather or keeping irrigation channels clear. Advice wrapped inside melody proved easier to remember than long lectures. Modern teachers might call it educational reinforcement. Ancient farmers simply called it singing. By midday, sunlight glittered across thousands of tiny ripples. The songs slowed slightly as the heat increased. Workers saved their energy. Voices softened. Instead of lively choruses, quieter melodies drifted gently through the warm air. They blended with the steady sound of flowing water, the distant call of cuckoos, the rustle of bamboo leaves stirred by a light breeze, the occasional splash made by someone discovering an unexpectedly deep patch of mud. The mud, historians can now confidently report, remained undefeated. Some songs spoke of the rice itself, not merely as food, almost as a companion. Many farming cultures viewed rice with deep respect, sometimes even believing it possessed a spirit deserving kindness and gratitude. To sing while planting was not simply entertainment. It was, in some communities, a gesture of respect toward the living crop that would nourish everyone through the coming year. Different villages expressed this belief differently, yet the feeling remained remarkably similar. Treat the rice well. Treat one another well. Hope the harvest returns the kindness. One afternoon, clouds gathered unexpectedly over the mountains. The wind cooled. The workers looked toward the sky. No one panicked. Instead, someone quietly began another familiar song. Its melody was slower, calmer, almost reflective. Others joined. Their voices drifted across the terraces, just as the first gentle raindrops touched the flooded fields. No one hurried away. Spring rain was often a blessing. The seedlings welcomed it. The mountains seemed to welcome it too. Water spread across the terrace surfaces in tiny circles, each raindrop creating ripples that briefly interrupted the reflections before fading into stillness again. The song continued, softer now, almost blending with the rainfall itself. It became difficult to tell where human music ended and nature's music began. Perhaps there was never much difference. As evening approached, the day's final verses echoed faintly across the valley. One row of workers answered another. Their voices bounced gently from hillside to hillside before slowly disappearing into the forests beyond. Tomorrow morning, the songs would begin again, not because anyone demanded them, not because written rules required them, because generations before had discovered something wonderfully simple. A shared melody makes heavy work feel lighter. A familiar chorus reminds tired hearts that they are not working alone. And sometimes, in the quiet history of ordinary people, the greatest legacy is not a monument carved from stone or a proclamation written on silk. Sometimes it is simply a song remembered by a grandchild, sung beside flowing water, carried by the morning breeze across flooded terraces, and passed as faithfully as the rice itself from one spring to the next. The next chapter, Local Gods and Rice Rituals, explores the spiritual traditions, seasonal ceremonies, offerings, and beliefs that surrounded rice planting, revealing How many farming communities sought harmony with nature long before the first seedlings touched the water? Part 10. Local Gods and Rice. Rituals. Long before the first seedling touched the mud, before the terraces filled with water, before the songs drifted across the mountains, many farming communities did something that might seem strangely familiar to us. They hoped, deeply, earnestly, sometimes desperately, because no matter how skilled the farmers became, there remained one uncomfortable truth hanging quietly over every planting season. Human beings could work incredibly hard. Nature still had the final vote. A single storm arriving at the wrong moment could destroy weeks of labor. Too little rain could wither young plants. Too much rain could wash away entire terrace walls. Insects could arrive uninvited. Disease could spread silently. Cold winds could linger longer than expected, and mountains, beautiful as they were, rarely accepted complaints. So across East and Southeast Asia, people sought comfort where human beings have often sought it throughout history. They turned toward the sacred. Different villages used different names, different gods, different spirits, different prayers, yet beneath all those differences rested a remarkably familiar feeling. Please let this year be enough. Please let our families eat. Please let the rice survive. In a small mountain village in Japan, planting season often began at the local shrine. Nothing grand, no towering marble columns, no armies of priests dressed in dazzling robes, just weathered wooden beams, darkened by rain and age, a stone pathway, a few hanging bells, the quiet scent of cedar drifting through the morning air. Villagers arrived carrying simple offerings, rice cakes, salt, fresh water, branches of evergreen, sometimes a small cup of sake, not because the gods required elaborate gifts, but because gratitude often speaks through sharing. Children walked beside their parents, trying very hard to behave with appropriate seriousness. Some succeeded, others became distracted by insects, birds, or the fascinating possibility that ringing the shrine bell twice might be even better than ringing it once. The gods, one imagines, had considerable experience with children. An elderly woman bowed deeply before the shrine. Her hands trembled slightly with age. This was not her first planting season, nor her 10th. She had watched years of abundance and years of hardship, floods, cold springs, excellent harvests, disappointing ones. She understood something youth often learns slowly. Success is never guaranteed. Gratitude should never wait until afterward. Across many regions of Japan, people honored deities associated with agriculture and rice cultivation. Among them was the belief in Ta no Kami, often understood as a spirit connected to the rice fields. In some communities, it was believed that this spirit descended from the mountains in spring and returned after harvest. The details varied from village to village. Traditions rarely stay perfectly still. They grow and change, much like the communities that keep them alive. But the underlying message remained beautifully simple. Treat the land with respect. Treat the rice with respect. Do not take abundance for granted. In China, agricultural rituals stretched back thousands of years. Emperors themselves sometimes performed ceremonial plowing rituals, symbolically demonstrating the importance of farming to the entire realm. It was a powerful message, Even the ruler of an empire ultimately depended upon the harvest. A crown, after all, is considerably less useful than dinner. Beyond the imperial ceremonies, ordinary villages honored local gods, ancestors, and protective spirits. Incense smoke curled upward from small family altars. Offerings were placed beside fields. Prayers were spoken quietly, often with no audience except the mountains and the sky. History preserved the words of emperors. It rarely recorded the whispered hopes of farmers. Yet those quiet prayers may have been among the most sincere words ever spoken. In Korea, seasonal rituals, known as gutgur or village ceremonies, sometimes sought blessings for prosperity, health, and successful harvests. Communities gathered together, music was played, offerings were made. The line between celebration and prayer often blurred, perhaps because gratitude and hope are close relatives. One village elder explained it this way to a curious child. "We work because we must." He pointed toward the mountains, "and we pray because we cannot control everything." The child considered this carefully. Do the spirits always listen? The elder smiled. "I don't know." He looked toward the terraces. "But listening reminds us to be humble." That answer had likely taken many years to learn. Throughout Southeast Asia, beliefs surrounding rice often carried extraordinary depth. In places such as Indonesia and parts of mainland Southeast Asia, rice was sometimes associated with protective spirits or divine figures connected to fertility and abundance. The rice itself was not merely a crop. It could be treated almost like a respected guest. Farmers spoke gently during planting. Certain rituals accompanied sowing and harvesting. Offerings acknowledged the life that sustained human life. Modern audiences may call these practices superstition. Ancient farmers might have called them gratitude. Perhaps those ideas are not always as far apart as they seem. Back in our mountain village, preparations for the planting ritual began before sunrise. Women arranged offerings on woven trays. Children gathered flowers. An elderly man carefully cleaned the small stone altar overlooking the terraces. He moved slowly, not because the task was difficult, because important things deserved patience. The village priest, or perhaps simply the most respected elder, depending on local tradition, stood before the gathered families. No one expected a long speech. Farmers have historically preferred concise meetings whenever possible. There was work waiting, but for a few quiet moments, everyone stood together, hands folded, heads bowed, listening. The wind moved softly through the trees. Water flowed steadily through the irrigation channels. Birds called somewhere high above the valley. Even nature seemed to pause. A short prayer was spoken. Thanks for surviving winter. Hope for favorable weather. Protection for the seedlings. Health for the families. Strength for the work ahead. Simple words, enormous meaning. Nearby, a little girl whispered to her grandmother, "Will the rice hear us?" Her grandmother smiled warmly. "If we care for it properly, yes." The child nodded, as though this made perfect sense. Perhaps it did, because whether one believed in spirits, gods, ancestors, or simply the quiet dignity of nature itself, the lesson remained remarkably similar. Respect what feeds you. After the prayers, a symbolic first planting often took place. An elder stepped carefully into the flooded terrace. A few seedlings were pressed gently into the mud, not hurried, not rushed, deliberate. Every movement carried centuries of memory. The watching children remained unusually quiet. Even they sensed this moment mattered. Tomorrow, the terraces would fill with hundreds of workers. Tomorrow would bring exhaustion, laughter, aching backs, and endless repetition. But today began with gratitude, and perhaps that mattered just as much. Because rituals serve many purposes. They connect people to their ancestors. They strengthen communities. They remind exhausted workers that they are part of something larger than themselves, and sometimes they offer comfort in a world where certainty is impossible. Farmers understood uncertainty better than most. They planted anyway. That may be one of the bravest acts in human history. To place seeds in the earth while knowing storms exist, to work despite not controlling the outcome, to hope after remembering previous disappointments. Spring after spring, generation after generation, there is courage in that, quiet courage, the kind history often overlooks. As evening settled over the mountains, the offerings remained beside the small shrine. Incense smoke drifted upward into the cooling air. Lantern light flickered softly against weathered wood. Tomorrow, the village would return to the terraces. The work would continue. The songs would return. The mud would undoubtedly continue winning occasional arguments. But tonight, for a few peaceful hours, the villagers rested, knowing they had done everything they could. They had prepared the fields. They had prepared the seedlings. And they had prepared their hearts. The rest belonged to spring. And spring, like the gods themselves, kept her own counsel. The next chapter, Imperial Tax Collectors, will reveal how emperors, kings, and governments often measured wealth, not in gold, but in rice, and how ordinary farming families carried the enormous burden of feeding entire states through their yearly harvests. Part 11, Imperial Tax Collectors. If you had asked one of our mountain farmers why they worked so tirelessly every spring, the answer probably would not have been, because I enjoy standing knee-deep in mud while my back slowly negotiates its retirement. It would have been much simpler. So my family can eat. That came first, always. But there was another reason as well, a reason that lived far beyond the quiet terraces, beyond the forests and rivers, beyond the nearest market town. Somewhere, perhaps hundreds of miles away, an emperor expected his share. The emperor, naturally, was unlikely to appear in person carrying a basket. History's rulers generally preferred considerably drier footwear. Instead, they sent tax collectors. Few people greeted their arrival with overwhelming excitement. Not because tax collectors were always cruel, many were simply doing the job assigned to them. But they represented an uncomfortable reality. No matter how hard a family worked, a portion of the harvest no longer belonged entirely to them. The rice growing in those shimmering terraces carried many futures. Some would feed children. Some would become seed for the following spring. Some would be traded in nearby markets. And some would begin a long journey toward government storehouses, military granaries, or the tables of officials who had probably never slipped face first into a flooded terrace. Life has never distributed irony particularly evenly. Across much of East Asia, rice was more than food. It was wealth, it was security, it was political power. In many regions, taxes were measured not in coins, but in grain. An empire could survive without elegant poetry. It found surviving without rice considerably more challenging. Imagine a bustling imperial capital, grand avenues crowded with merchants, officials hurrying between government offices, temples rising toward the sky, palaces surrounded by impressive walls, thousands upon thousands of people needing breakfast every morning. None of it functioned unless villages like ours quietly continued planting rice. Civilization has always rested on surprisingly muddy foundations. In ancient China, successive dynasties depended heavily upon agricultural taxes. Officials carefully recorded harvests, estimated yields, and organized the collection of grain. Some administrations developed remarkably sophisticated systems. Granaries stored surplus rice against future famines. Canals transported grain across enormous distances. Government clerks filled endless scrolls with numbers. Someone, somewhere, has apparently always believed paperwork could solve everything. Sometimes they were even correct. The famous Grand Canal eventually linked fertile southern rice-growing regions with northern capitals, allowing astonishing quantities of grain to travel hundreds of miles. It became one of history's greatest engineering achievements. Yet every sack loaded onto a barge began exactly where we have been spending our evenings, in a flooded terrace, placed there by human hands, one seedling at a time. Back in our village, however, those distant systems felt very far away. The farmers did not discuss canal logistics while transplanting rice. They discussed weather, their children, the stubborn buffalo, whether the mountain stream seemed lower than last spring. Still, everyone understood that when harvest arrived, someone from the government would eventually appear. Not today, months from now, but inevitably. One spring afternoon, while workers rested beneath the shade of a large chestnut tree, a young boy asked his grandfather, "Why do we give away rice if we worked so hard to grow it?" The old man took a long drink of water before answering, "Because the roads must be repaired." He counted on one finger. The soldiers must eat. Another finger. The bridges must stand. A third. The officials say the empire needs it. The boy frowned. Does it? The grandfather smiled in the patient way grandparents often do when confronted with questions. Philosophers have debated for centuries. Sometimes, and the other times? The old man chuckled softly. The other times. He looked toward the distant mountains. I suspect someone important simply enjoys eating. Several nearby farmers quietly laughed. Gentle sarcasm, it seems, survives every dynasty. Not every tax collector fit the frightening image later stories sometimes created. Many were local officials, familiar with the communities they served. Some understood exactly how difficult farming could be. Others had grown up in villages before entering government service. A few tried to balance imperial demands with practical reality. After all, collecting every grain from starving farmers usually guaranteed there would be very little to collect the following year. Even bureaucracies occasionally recognize long-term planning. Unfortunately, not everyone shared such wisdom. History contains more than enough examples of corruption, greed, and officials eager to impress their superiors by demanding more than struggling families could reasonably provide. Poor harvests complicated everything. A season of drought did not necessarily reduce expectations from distant administrators. Floods rarely asked permission before destroying tax records. Nature had an irritating habit of ignoring government schedules. Japan developed its own relationship between rice and taxation. For centuries, the wealth of powerful lords was often measured not simply by the land they controlled, but by the amount of rice that land could theoretically produce. The unit known as koku represented enough rice to feed one adult for roughly a year. A domain's importance could therefore be estimated through agricultural productivity. One could say that political influence came measured in bowls of rice. It sounds surprisingly practical, because it was. Samurai received stipends linked to rice. Castles depended upon rice. Cities flourished because surrounding villages supplied rice. Behind every polished suit of armor stood countless anonymous farmers, whose names history never bothered to record. The armor looked considerably more dramatic. The rice was considerably more useful. In Korea, kingdoms likewise relied upon agricultural production to support administration, military service, and public works. Rice and other grains formed the backbone of state revenue. Harvests affected everything from local markets to royal courts. The fortunes of rulers rose and fell with the success of ordinary farming families. Kings may have worn silk. They still depended upon muddy feet. Back in the mountain village, planting season continued. No tax collector stood beside the terraces counting seedlings. That would have been wonderfully impractical. Instead, everyone understood the larger cycle. Plant carefully, protect the crop, harvest wisely, store enough for winter, set aside seed, meet obligations, hope something remained. One elderly widow quietly measured the previous year's remaining rice in a large wooden container. She calculated how much her household would need until the next harvest. Then she calculated how much might eventually be owed. The numbers did not always leave much room for comfort. Still, she smiled when her grandson entered the room. Children deserved reassurance more than arithmetic. Village cooperation often softened difficult years. Families shared labor during planting. Sometimes they quietly shared grain during hardship. One successful harvest might help several struggling households survive until spring returned. Communities understood something distant. Governments occasionally forgot. A hungry neighbor today might become tomorrow's helper. Compassion carried practical value. As summer approached, the tiny seedlings, standing in neat rows across the flooded terraces, began slowly reaching toward the sky. Each new leaf represented possibility. Each healthy plant quietly increased the family's hopes. Yet every green shoot also represented responsibility. Some belonged to the household. Some belonged to the future. Some, eventually, belonged to the empire. It was an arrangement few could ignore. One evening, after another long day in the fields, a young woman sat outside her farmhouse, watching the sunset reflected across the terraces. Her grandmother joined her. "Do you ever wish we could keep all of it?" the younger woman asked. The old woman looked across the valley. "Of course," she paused. "But wishing has never filled a granary. The younger woman laughed softly. No, it hasn't. The grandmother smiled. So tomorrow, she stood carefully, stretching her tired back. We plant a little better. Simple words. Quiet wisdom. Throughout history, ordinary people have often carried extraordinary burdens with remarkable dignity. They paid taxes, raised children, repaired terraces, shared songs, helped neighbors, and somehow found the strength to begin again every spring. Their names rarely appeared in imperial records. The amount of grain they produced certainly did. As darkness settled over the mountain village, lanterns glowed warmly behind paper windows. The terraces reflected the first stars of evening. Far away, beyond countless rivers and roads, an emperor might have been discussing matters of state. Closer to home, one grandmother quietly measured tomorrow's breakfast. One grandfather repaired another basket. One child dreamed of chasing dragonflies across flooded fields. History often remembers the empire, but without villages like this one, there would have been no empire to remember. Everything, in the end, began with the patient hands of farmers and the tiny green seedlings swaying gently beneath the spring sky. The next chapter, Years of Famine, explores the heartbreaking seasons when drought, floods, insects, and disease shattered the hopes of farming communities, revealing how entire villages struggled to survive when the rice harvest failed. Part 12, Years of Famine. For several chapters now, we've enjoyed something that every ancient farmer quietly hoped for. A good year. The terraces were repaired. The water flowed when it should. The seedlings settled comfortably into the mud. The village worked together. The songs echoed across the mountains. Everyone went home tired, but hopeful. It is a pleasant story. History, unfortunately, rarely allows pleasant stories to continue forever, because every farming family, no matter how experienced, eventually faced a season they would remember for the rest of their lives. The year when spring looked perfectly ordinary, and everything slowly fell apart. Famine rarely announced itself dramatically. There was no messenger riding through the valley shouting, "Terrible news, everyone. Things will become increasingly difficult over the next several months." Nature preferred subtler introductions. A rainstorm that never arrived. A stream flowing just a little lower than usual. An unusually warm wind. A colder night. Tiny changes, barely noticeable, until one day everyone realized they had become impossible to ignore. One elderly farmer stood beside the irrigation channel before sunrise. He watched the water moving toward the terraces. Or rather, he watched how little water was moving toward the terraces. The stream had become narrower, not alarmingly, not yet, but narrower all the same. He frowned. His son noticed. "Is something wrong?" The old man remained silent for a moment. Finally he answered, "I've seen the stream look like this before." His son waited. When? The old man's eyes stayed fixed on the water. "The year we lost half the harvest." No one spoke after that. Sometimes memory weighs more than words. The village continued planting. After all, what else could they do? No farmer has ever solved a drought by worrying more enthusiastically. Work continued, hope continued. But now, every glance toward the sky lasted a little longer. Clouds became important. Wind direction became important. Even the smell of the air after sunset seemed worthy of discussion. Nature had everyone's complete attention. She remained characteristically mysterious. Across northern China, droughts occasionally transformed fertile fields into cracked earth. Rice, which loved shallow standing water, suddenly found itself competing for every drop. Irrigation channels carried less each week. Reservoirs shrank. Streams retreated into rocky beds. Villages began discussing water schedules with increasing seriousness. Arguments, once rare, became more common, not because people had become cruel, because thirsty fields leave little room for comfort. One family opened their irrigation gate during the night. Another discovered less water than expected the following morning. Voices grew louder, then quieter again. Eventually, the elders gathered everyone beneath a large elm tree. One elderly woman spoke before anyone else could begin another argument. If we fight each other, she pointed toward the nearly empty channel. The mountain still won't give us more water. Silence followed. She was right. The problem had never been the neighbors. The problem was the sky. Throughout Japan's long agricultural history, villages also endured years of failed harvests. Some springs arrived too cold. Others brought endless rain that flooded fields beyond recovery. Typhoons flattened crops only weeks before harvest. The rice, after surviving months of careful attention, disappeared beneath violent winds in a single afternoon. Nature has never signed agreements promising fairness. One young girl remembered her father smiling while transplanting seedlings in early spring. By midsummer, she noticed something different. He spent more time staring at the sky, less time singing. Children often recognize worry before adults realize they are showing it. At supper one evening, she asked, "When will the rain stop?" Her mother looked toward the window, where another steady downpour blurred the distant terraces. "I don't know. Will the rice be all right?" A pause. "We'll do everything we can." It was an honest answer. Sometimes honesty is the kindest thing available. Heavy rain could be almost as dangerous as drought. Terrace walls softened. Stone foundations shifted. Small cracks appeared. Water, usually such a faithful partner, became frighteningly powerful. One retaining wall collapsed just after dawn. The sound echoed through the valley like distant thunder. Workers rushed uphill. Too late. An entire section of flooded terrace had broken apart. Mud, stones, seedlings, and precious soil tumbled into the fields below. Fortunately, no one stood in its path. The terraces could be rebuilt. Lives could not. For days afterward, neighbors worked together, repairing the damage, not because success was guaranteed, because giving up guaranteed failure. There is remarkable courage hidden inside persistence. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding the same wall for the third time. Across Korea, farmers also endured difficult years when harvests failed. Cold springs delayed planting. Summer storms damaged growing rice. Insects multiplied. Plant diseases spread silently through warm, damp fields. Entire villages watched healthy green terraces slowly turn yellow long before autumn. One experienced grandmother walked slowly through the rice. One afternoon, she gently lifted several leaves. Dark spots covered them. She sighed, not dramatically, just quietly. She had seen the disease before. The younger farmers gathered around. "Can we save it?" someone asked. She looked across the field. Some, only one word. Sometimes, history fits inside a single sentence. The hardest years were those when several disasters arrived together. First drought, then insects, then a late storm. Nature occasionally displayed astonishing creativity, as though one problem simply wasn't ambitious enough. During those seasons, villages relied upon every reserve they possessed: stored grain, dried vegetables, beans saved from previous harvests, chestnuts gathered in autumn forests, wild greens collected from mountain slopes. Nothing edible was ignored. People became remarkably inventive when necessity joined the conversation. Meals grew smaller, rice porridge became thinner, children received slightly larger portions. Adults quietly insisted they weren't very hungry. Parents have been telling that particular story for thousands of years. One evening, a little boy looked into his bowl. "There isn't much tonight." His grandmother smiled warmly. "It tastes better slowly." He nodded and carefully ate every spoonful. Only later, after he had fallen asleep, did his mother notice that his grandmother had quietly given away part of her own supper. No speeches, no recognition, just love disguised as ordinary behavior. History rarely records those moments. Perhaps it should. Ancient governments sometimes opened public granaries during severe famines. Wise rulers understood that helping struggling farmers protected both lives and future harvests. Some administrations reduced taxes after catastrophic seasons. Others organized grain distribution. Unfortunately, not every official acted wisely. Corruption occasionally diverted supplies. Poor planning worsened shortages. Even well-intentioned governments struggled against disasters affecting enormous regions. Empires could build canals. They could not command rain. Throughout East and Southeast Asia, famine left lasting memories. Not always written memories. Family memories. Grandparents telling grandchildren, "Never waste rice." At first glance, the advice seemed simple, but behind those 3 words often stood an entire generation's experience with hunger. Every grain mattered because someone remembered when every grain had been precious. One elderly farmer picked up a single grain that had fallen beside the storage basket. His grandson laughed gently. "It's only one." The old man carefully placed it back inside. Today, he looked kindly at the child. "Today, it's one." Then he gestured toward the full basket. "Tomorrow, it becomes a habit." The boy never forgot. Neither did the generations after him. Even during difficult years, however, hope refused to disappear completely. One gentle spring rain after weeks of drought could transform an entire valley's mood. Neighbors smiled again. Children splashed happily through newly flowing channels. The songs slowly returned to the terraces. Farmers have always possessed extraordinary optimism, perhaps because farming itself requires believing in tomorrow. You plant long before you harvest. You work long before you see results. Hope is not optional. It is part of the job. As autumn finally approached, some famine years ended with disappointing harvests. Others ended with enough. Not abundant, not comfortable. Enough. Sometimes enough became the greatest blessing imaginable. The mountain village survived because people shared, because neighbors rebuilt walls together, because grandparents sacrificed quietly, because families protected seed for the following spring. even when hunger tempted them otherwise. Above all, they survived because they refused to believe one terrible season would be the end of their story. The terraces would fill again. The water would return. The seedlings would once more stand bright green beneath the morning sun. Spring always came back, not quickly, not easily, but faithfully. And when it did, the villagers, older, wiser, perhaps carrying a few more memories than they wished, would once again step into the flooded fields, bend toward the earth, and begin the ancient work all over again. Because history is not only the story of triumph, it is also the story of people who kept planting after disappointment, again and again, one seedling at a time. The next chapter, Monsoon Disasters, will explore the terrifying power of seasonal storms, flash floods, landslides, and typhoons that could transform peaceful mountain terraces into dangerous rivers within a matter of hours. Part 13, Monsoon Disasters, if drought, taught farmers the pain of waiting for water. The monsoon taught them something equally unsettling. Sometimes there could be far too much of it. For weeks, perhaps even months, the villagers had prayed for steady rain, gentle rain, patient rain, the sort that soaked quietly into the earth while the rice stretched happily toward the sky. Nature listened. Then, every so often, she dramatically overachieved. The first signs were rarely frightening. A few dark clouds gathered beyond the mountains. The breeze shifted direction. The air became strangely heavy, as though the valley itself had stopped breathing. Birds flew lower than usual. Swallows skimmed close to the flooded terraces. Even the frogs seemed unusually energetic. One elderly woman looked toward the western ridge and frowned. Her granddaughter noticed immediately. "Is it going to rain?" The old woman nodded slowly. "Yes." The child smiled. "That's good." The grandmother looked back at the clouds, now growing darker by the minute. "It depends." She paused. "On when the rain decides to stop." There was wisdom hidden inside that sentence. Every farmer understood it. The difference between a blessing and a disaster could sometimes be measured in only a few hours. The morning remained calm. Workers continued transplanting seedlings. The songs floated gently across the terraces. Water sparkled beneath the spring sunlight. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, sometime after midday, the light began to fade, not because evening had arrived, because enormous clouds rolled over the mountain peaks, swallowing the blue sky one piece at a time. The valley grew strangely quiet. Wind disappeared. Leaves stopped moving. Even conversation became softer. Nature has curious ways of asking for everyone's attention. The first raindrop landed beside a young boy's foot, then another, then 5 more. Within minutes, the rain became steady. The workers smiled. Good. The seedlings needed water. Someone even laughed, saying perhaps they could finally stop carrying so many buckets. Then the rain grew heavier. The laughter stopped. Across much of East and Southeast Asia, seasonal monsoon rains have shaped agriculture for thousands of years. Without them, rice cultivation on such a vast scale would have been nearly impossible. Yet those same life-giving rains sometimes arrived with astonishing force. Mountain valleys became rivers. Quiet streams transformed into roaring torrents. Terraces, carefully maintained for generations, suddenly faced unimaginable pressure. Nature has always insisted that great gifts often carry equally great risks. The rain continued, hour after hour. By late afternoon, every path had become slippery. Water poured from rooftops in shining curtains. Small channels overflowed. The irrigation system, so carefully balanced only days before, struggled to keep pace. One farmer stood beside a wooden water gate. Normally, adjusting it required only a gentle push. Today, the current fought back. The water surged through the opening with surprising strength. His son hurried over to help. Together, they managed to lower the gate just enough to redirect part of the flow. For a few precious moments, the upper terraces stabilized. Then another channel overflowed farther uphill. The mountain, it seemed, had developed entirely new ideas. Lightning flashed beyond the distant ridges. Several seconds later came the thunder, not a sharp crack, a deep, rolling sound that echoed through every valley. Children instinctively moved closer to their parents. The older villagers remained calm, not because they felt no fear, because they had heard this conversation between mountain and sky many times before. Fear, they knew, accomplished very little. Preparation mattered more. Throughout southern China, where monsoon systems often brought intense seasonal rainfall, farming communities developed extraordinary engineering techniques to cope with floods. Terraces included carefully designed overflow channels. Stone retaining walls allowed excess water to escape without carrying away the precious soil. Villages constantly inspected drainage systems before the rainy season. Centuries of experience had taught them one simple lesson: water always finds a path. Your job is to help it choose the right one. In the famous mountain terraces of southern China and across Southeast Asia, generations spent countless hours reinforcing embankments with grasses whose roots helped hold the soil together. Bamboo stakes strengthened weaker sections. Loose stones were replaced. Drainage ditches cleared. The work never truly ended. A terrace was not something you built once. It was something you cared for forever. By evening, the rain had become relentless. The peaceful reflections that had once mirrored clouds now churned beneath thousands of falling drops. The terraces no longer resembled calm staircases climbing the mountain. They looked like cascading waterfalls. One elderly farmer walked carefully along the upper wall, carrying a lantern shielded beneath his straw hat. The flame flickered wildly in the wind. He stopped every few steps to inspect the stonework. Small cracks, flowing water, nothing serious. Yet, nearby, another villager called out, "Over here!" Several people hurried toward the sound. A narrow section of retaining wall had begun leaking muddy water through tiny gaps. Not enough to panic, enough to act. Immediately, without discussion, neighbors formed a line. Some carried stones. Others filled woven baskets with earth. Women packed wet clay into openings with their bare hands. Teenagers hauled heavy rocks from a nearby hillside. Even children helped by carrying smaller pieces. No one asked whose terrace it was. At moments like these, ownership became less important than survival. One wall protected everyone below it. The rain soaked every piece of clothing. Mud clung to sandals. Lantern light reflected from countless drops falling through the darkness. Someone slipped. Two others caught him before he slid down the embankment. A brief laugh followed, not because it was especially funny, because relief often sounds like laughter. The wall held, for now. Typhoons brought even greater challenges to Japan and parts of coastal East Asia. These enormous storms combined violent winds with overwhelming rain. Rice nearing harvest could be flattened in a single night. Terrace walls, weakened by saturated soil, sometimes collapsed days later. Villages learned never to celebrate simply because the storm had passed. The mountain often continued rearranging itself long afterward. One grandmother remembered a typhoon from her childhood. She told the story while mending clothing beside the evening fire. The rain lasted 3 days. Her grandson looked up. 3 whole days. She nodded. When we finally came outside, she paused. The path to the next village was gone. The children stared wide-eyed. Gone? The mountain decided it belonged somewhere else. There was no anger in her voice, only respect. Living beside mountains teaches remarkable humility. Landslides became one of the greatest fears during prolonged rainfall. The soil, loosened by endless water, could suddenly begin moving downhill. Trees tilted, rocks shifted. Then, with frightening speed, entire slopes might give way. Villagers watched carefully for warning signs. Fresh cracks appearing across pathways, unusual sounds beneath the ground, water emerging where none had flowed before. The mountains often whispered before they shouted. Experienced farmers listened. One young man noticed a new crack running across the edge of a terrace. He immediately called his father. The older man crouched, running his hand gently across the damp earth. Without hesitation, he turned toward the village. We leave this one. No debate, no heroic speeches. Some things cannot be argued with. Nature occasionally wins. The wise simply step aside. Fortunately, not every storm ended in disaster. Many passed with little lasting damage. The terraces filled. The rice drank deeply. The streams flowed clear once again. The villagers repaired a few walls, cleared fallen branches, and quietly returned to their ordinary routines. Experience had taught them not to celebrate too early, but neither did they surrender to fear. Hope, after all, grows surprisingly well beside caution. When the rain finally stopped, the valley changed almost overnight. Mist rose from the terraces with the morning sun. Birds returned to the trees. Dragonflies danced above the flooded fields. The songs gradually drifted across the mountains once more. Workers inspected every terrace, one wall at a time, one channel at a time, one seedling at a time. Damage could be repaired. Life could continue. As an elderly farmer looked across the shining fields, his grandson asked, "Were you scared?" The old man smiled thoughtfully. "Of course. But you stayed." He nodded. Someone had to welcome the sun back. Perhaps that is one of history's quietest forms of courage. Not charging into impossible danger. Not pretending fear does not exist. Simply remaining ready to rebuild when the storm has finally passed. For thousands of years, monsoon rains shaped the rhythm of life across Asia. They filled rivers, fed terraces, turned mountains green, destroyed walls, tested patience, rewarded preparation, and reminded every generation of farmers that while human hands could guide water with remarkable skill, they could never truly command it. The terraces endured because the people who cared for them understood this simple truth: respect the mountain, respect the rain, and when the clouds finally part, pick up your tools, gather your neighbors, and begin again, just as your grandparents did and their grandparents before them. The next chapter, samurai, peasants, and rice, will explore how the elegant world of Japan's samurai was quietly supported by generations of anonymous rice farmers, revealing the surprising connection between warriors, taxes, and the humble mountain terraces. Part 14, Samurai, Peasants, and Rice. If someone asked you to picture a samurai, you would probably imagine polished armor, a curved sword, perhaps a proud horse standing dramatically beneath cherry blossoms. Maybe someone staring thoughtfully into the distance while a gentle breeze performs remarkable feats for their hair. History has always appreciated a dramatic entrance. What it rarely shows is breakfast. Someone had to grow it. Long before a samurai polished his helmet, practiced swordsmanship, or pledged loyalty to his lord, ordinary farmers had already been awake for hours, standing ankle-deep in muddy terraces, carefully tending the rice that would eventually feed warriors, officials, monks, merchants, and nearly everyone else. It is one of history's quieter truths. Behind every shining suit of armor stood countless anonymous peasants whose names disappeared from the records long ago. The armor survived in museums. The people who made it possible mostly survived in silence. Back in our mountain village, spring carried on much as it always had. The seedlings had settled into their new homes. Fresh green leaves reached confidently toward the sky. The irrigation channels murmured softly as water continued its patient journey from the mountains. Life appeared peaceful, yet far beyond these quiet terraces, political struggles shaped the destiny of entire provinces. Powerful lords competed for land. Alliances formed. Alliances collapsed. Castles rose. Armies marched. Messengers galloped along, winding roads carrying urgent letters sealed with elegant crests. Meanwhile, one elderly farmer quietly repaired a broken hoe. History can feel wonderfully unbalanced sometimes, because while the chronicles celebrated famous battles, someone still had to worry about whether tomorrow's irrigation gate might leak. In Japan, particularly during the medieval and early modern periods, rice became far more than food. It became the foundation of economic and political power. The wealth of a domain was often measured in koku, a unit representing roughly the amount of rice needed to feed one adult for a year. A lord's influence depended not only upon the number of soldiers he commanded, but also upon the productive capacity of the land under his control. Rice fed armies. Rice paid retainers. Rice financed castles. Rice sustained governments. In many ways, rice became the currency beneath the currency. The farmers, of course, rarely described their work using economic terminology. To them, the terraces represented something far simpler: home. One spring morning, a teenage boy watched several mounted samurai riding along the distant road toward the regional castle. Their armor glimmered faintly beneath the sunlight. The horses looked magnificent. The boy paused in his work. They look important. His grandfather glanced up briefly before returning to straightening young rice plants. They are. The boy continued watching. I wonder what it's like. The old man smiled gently. I wonder if they've ever planted rice. The boy laughed. Probably not. Then they are missing something. What? The grandfather looked across the flooded terraces. The satisfaction of knowing where dinner comes from. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet amusement. The old farmer understood that every role in society carried responsibilities. Still, he also knew something many rulers occasionally forgot. A sword cannot harvest grain. Throughout much of Japanese history, peasants occupied an essential yet tightly regulated position within society. The social order often placed warriors above farmers in terms of status and authority. Yet there was a fascinating contradiction hidden inside that hierarchy. The warriors depended completely upon the harvest. Without successful farmers, castles grew hungry surprisingly quickly. Even the finest armor becomes rather uncomfortable on an empty stomach. Village life reflected this relationship in subtle ways. Tax obligations remained serious. Harvest estimates were carefully monitored. Officials occasionally visited to inspect fields or record agricultural production. Most interactions were routine. Some became tense. A poor harvest could place enormous pressure upon both farmers and administrators. Neither side controlled the weather. Both suffered its consequences. One local official arrived during late spring to inspect the developing crop. He wore simple robes rather than elaborate armor, but his position carried authority nonetheless. Several villagers greeted him politely. He walked slowly along the terrace walls, observing the young rice. Finally, he stopped beside an elderly woman who was carefully clearing weeds from an irrigation channel. "How does the crop look this year?" he asked. She straightened slowly, wiping mud from her hands. "It looks hopeful." The official nodded. "Hopeful is good." The old woman smiled. "It is." Then she looked toward the sky. "But the weather hasn't given its opinion yet." The official laughed quietly. "No, it never tells us early." For a brief moment, both stood silently watching the water flow. One represented the government, the other represented the people feeding it. Nature, as always, represented herself. During Japan's long era of regional warfare known as the Sengoku period, armies moved frequently across the countryside. For farming communities, military campaigns could bring uncertainty. Soldiers needed food. Horses required grain. Roads became crowded. Occasionally, villages found themselves caught between competing lords. Most farmers wanted nothing more ambitious than a peaceful growing season. Rice proved remarkably indifferent to political debates. It simply kept growing whenever conditions allowed. Many samurai themselves came from families with deep agricultural roots. Earlier in Japanese history, the distinction between local warriors and prosperous farming households was often less rigid than later social structures suggested. Some warrior families still understood farming intimately. Others gradually became more distant from the land they governed. History enjoys creating complicated family trees. One rainy afternoon, while repairing a collapsed terrace wall, a young farmer asked his uncle, "Do you think the Lord knows how much work goes into one field?" His uncle carefully placed another stone before answering, "I think." He pressed the rock firmly into the wet earth. He knows enough to value the harvest. The young man frowned, and enough to appreciate us. The older farmer smiled. That depends on the Lord. Practical wisdom rarely comes wrapped in dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives while stacking stones. The famous castles of feudal Japan, those graceful structures rising above massive stone foundations, often symbolized military strength. Visitors admire their elegant roofs and commanding views. Yet, every castle kitchen depended upon wagons of rice arriving from villages like ours. The walls protected power. The rice sustained it. Without one, the other eventually failed. Seasonal festivals occasionally brought farmers and local authorities together. Successful harvests were celebrated with gratitude, music, dances, and offerings at shrines. Even officials responsible for collecting taxes understood the joy of an abundant year. Good harvests reduced conflict. Full granaries created stability. Hungry people rarely remained peaceful for long. One autumn festival featured children running through the village, carrying small bundles of freshly harvested rice. An elderly samurai assigned to the nearby castle happened to witness the celebration while traveling. He stopped his horse. For several quiet minutes, he simply watched. Children laughing, grandmothers smiling, young couples carrying baskets together, the smell of freshly cooked rice drifting through the evening air. His younger companion asked, "Should we continue?" The older warrior shook his head. In a moment, he watched a little longer. Then he spoke almost to himself. "This," he looked across the busy village, "is what we're supposed to protect." The younger samurai remained silent. Perhaps that was the most important lesson of the day. The finest purpose of strength is protecting ordinary life, not overshadowing it. As centuries passed, farming techniques improved. New rice varieties appeared. Irrigation systems expanded. Terraces climbed higher into the mountains. Communities adapted continuously. Political systems changed. Dynasties ended. Shoguns rose and fell. Castles changed hands. The rice kept growing. There is something wonderfully humbling about that. History often feels obsessed with extraordinary individuals. Yet civilizations survive because millions of ordinary people quietly repeat ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. Plant, weed, repair, harvest, store. Begin again. One evening, as the setting sun painted the terraces with shades of gold and amber, the teenage boy from earlier sat beside his grandfather, overlooking the valley. "The samurai have exciting lives," he said thoughtfully. His grandfather nodded. "Sometimes." The boy looked toward the endless rows of rice. "Our lives seem smaller." The old man smiled. He picked up a single grain of rice, left from the evening meal, and placed it carefully into the boy's hand. "Hold this." The boy did. "Now imagine there isn't another one." The boy looked down quietly. The grandfather continued, "If no one grows this," he gently closed the boy's fingers around the grain. "There are no castles." He pointed toward the distant hills. "No armies." He pointed toward the village below. "No festivals." Finally, he rested a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "There is only hunger." The boy looked once more across the peaceful terraces. For the first time, they seemed far larger than before, not because the mountains had changed, but because he finally understood what they truly supported. As darkness settled gently over the valley, lanterns flickered inside farmhouses, one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a castle guard began his nightly watch. Closer to home, a grandmother stirred tomorrow's rice over a quiet fire. A grandfather repaired another worn basket. Children drifted to sleep after another day of muddy adventures. And beneath the soft glow of the rising moon, the young rice continued growing, completely unconcerned with swords, titles, or power. It asked for only three things: water, patience, and human hands willing to return with the sunrise. Perhaps that is why rice outlasted so many warriors. It never sought glory, only life. The next chapter, the slow arrival of harvest season, follows. The quiet transformation from vibrant green terraces to fields of shimmering gold as months of patient labor finally begin to reveal whether spring's hopes will become autumn's reward. Part 15. Chinese Rice Dynasties. If the Terraces could speak, they would probably have one polite request for historians. Could you spend just a little less time talking about emperors and a little more time talking about the people standing in the mud? It would be a reasonable request. After all, emperors came and went. Dynasties rose with magnificent confidence before quietly collapsing in ways no one had predicted. Palaces burned, capitals moved, officials changed their robes, court poets found new patrons. Meanwhile, somewhere far from the imperial throne, an elderly farmer looked up at the morning sky and wondered whether today would finally be warm enough to weed the rice. History has always possessed an interesting sense of proportion. The names of emperors fill thick books. The names of the farmers who fed them are usually carried only by the wind. As our mountain village settled into the slow rhythm between planting and harvest, the young rice had grown noticeably taller. The brilliant green seedlings that had once looked almost fragile now swayed confidently beneath the summer breeze. Dragonflies hovered above the flooded terraces. Tiny fish darted through the irrigation channels. The endless labor of spring had given way to another kind of work: weeding, watching, repairing, waiting. Rice farming teaches patience with remarkable persistence. There are very few opportunities to hurry. Across China, that patience helped build one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations. While historians often divide Chinese history into dynasties, the Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, and many others, there is another way to tell the story, one bowl of rice at a time, because beneath every dynasty stood millions of farming families. Without them, there would have been no taxes to collect, no armies to supply, no cities to feed, no scholars to educate, no emperors to govern. The throne itself rested upon muddy fields. Whether the throne always appreciated that fact is another matter entirely. The Han Dynasty, which ruled for more than 4 centuries, beginning in 206 BCE, witnessed enormous agricultural development. Rice cultivation expanded steadily in southern China, where warmer climates and abundant rainfall created ideal growing conditions. Northern China remained closely associated with millet and wheat, but farther south, rice increasingly shaped everyday life. Government officials encouraged agricultural improvement. Irrigation systems expanded. New settlements appeared. The empire grew stronger, because ordinary people kept planting. One can almost imagine an imperial official proudly announcing a brilliant new agricultural policy. Somewhere, an old farmer probably replied, "That's wonderful," then quietly returned to pulling weeds. Policies matter. So does removing the weeds. The Han understood both. One afternoon, our young village boy, who had developed an admirable habit of asking difficult questions, sat beside his grandfather while they inspected the growing rice. "Grandfather, yes? Do emperors know every village?" The old man smiled without looking up. "No." "Do they know every farmer?" "No." The boy frowned. "Then how do they know if the rice is growing?" His grandfather gently touched one healthy stalk. "They don't." He pointed toward the mountains. "They trust people who trust people who trust people." The boy blinked. "That sounds complicated." "It usually becomes more complicated." The old man laughed softly. "So, it's best just to grow good rice." Perhaps that was the wisest administrative philosophy ever expressed. Several centuries later, during the magnificent Tang Dynasty, China entered one of its great golden ages. Poetry flourished. Trade expanded along the Silk Roads. Cities became larger and more prosperous. Art reached extraordinary heights. Visitors admired dazzling capitals, filled with music, scholars, merchants, and temples. Yet every busy marketplace depended upon grain arriving from countless villages. The celebrated poets occasionally praised moonlight, mountains, and friendship. One suspects they appreciated full stomachs as well. The Tang government invested heavily in maintaining canals and transportation networks. Grain moved across astonishing distances. Southern harvests supplied northern populations. The empire became connected through waterways that stretched for hundreds of miles. Boats carried sacks of rice toward cities where officials carefully recorded every shipment. Yet before reaching those boats, every grain passed through human hands. Someone bent over in a flooded field. Someone carried heavy baskets. Someone dried the harvest beneath the autumn sun. The paperwork began much later. The Song dynasty brought even more remarkable changes. If historians sometimes become unusually excited while discussing Chinese agriculture, this is one reason why. During the Song period, beginning in the 10th century, faster ripening rice varieties, particularly those introduced from Champa in present-day Vietnam, spread through parts of southern China. This development transformed agriculture. Farmers in many regions could harvest sooner. Some areas even managed 2 rice crops in a single year under favorable conditions. Imagine the reaction. An elderly farmer who had spent decades following one familiar rhythm suddenly discovered that the fields could produce even more. Not by magic, simply through careful adaptation. Innovation does not always arrive wearing impressive robes. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a different seed. Our village elder would have approved. He had always believed new ideas deserved consideration, provided they did not involve anyone suggesting that muddy work somehow became clean work. Some fantasies remain beyond even the greatest dynasties. The Song era also witnessed significant advances in farming tools, irrigation methods, and agricultural knowledge. Officials compiled manuals describing improved techniques. Scholars recorded observations about soils, planting schedules, and water management, knowledge spread gradually across regions, generation by generation, village by village. Not every innovation reached every farmer immediately. Travel remained slow. Communication depended upon people rather than electricity. Still, ideas moved, just as rivers move, patiently. One summer evening, an elderly woman gathered several children around while repairing a woven basket. She held up 2 handfuls of rice seeds. They looked the same. The children nodded. But they are not. One little girl leaned closer. How can you tell? The grandmother smiled. By planting them. There it was again. Another quiet lesson. The earth reveals truths that eyes alone cannot see. When the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty during the 13th century, China entered another new chapter. Empires changed. Rulers spoke different languages. Trade routes expanded farther across Asia. Yet in the villages, spring still meant preparing terraces. Summer still meant tending rice. Autumn still meant harvest. Ordinary people often experience political revolutions differently from rulers. Many simply continue doing yesterday's work under tomorrow's government. History changes headlines. The seasons continue anyway. During the Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, agriculture remained central to imperial prosperity. Large-scale irrigation projects continued. Population increased steadily. Rice-growing regions expanded further. Markets became increasingly active. Farmers sold surplus grain. Merchants transported goods between provinces. Village life gradually connected to wider commercial networks. An old grandfather watching boats loaded with rice might never have imagined where every sack would eventually travel. Then again, perhaps he did not need to. His responsibility ended where the harvest began. The Qing dynasty inherited both the achievements and challenges of those earlier centuries. By then, rice had become deeply woven into Chinese identity. Across much of the south, terraces climbed mountainsides. River valleys shimmered with flooded fields. Families repeated planting rituals whose origins stretched so far into the past that no one remembered who first began them. That is often the greatest sign of a successful tradition. Everyone remembers the practice. No one remembers needing to invent it. One traveler from another land visited southern China during the 18th century. Standing above an enormous valley of terraces, he reportedly struggled to believe human hands had shaped so much of the mountainside. The terraces stretched upward, like giant staircases disappearing into the clouds. He admired their beauty. The local farmers admired something else entirely. Whether the irrigation gate near the upper wall required another repair before the next rainfall, perspective changes everything. As our own village settled into another peaceful evening, the young rice swayed gently beneath the fading light. The children chased dragonflies between the terrace paths. Grandparents sat outside their homes, mending baskets and sharing stories. Somewhere, a traveling merchant carried news of distant officials and changing politics. The villagers listened politely. Then someone asked a far more immediate question. Will tomorrow be sunny? Because tomorrow determined whether weeds could be cleared, whether terrace walls needed reinforcing, whether irrigation channels required cleaning. Empires mattered. Tomorrow's weather mattered first. The boy looked across the valley and asked his grandfather one final question. So many dynasties have ruled China. His grandfather nodded. They have. Which one grew the best rice? The old man laughed so warmly that several nearby neighbors turned to look. I don't know. He reached down and gently touched a healthy green stalk. But this one, he smiled at the child, doesn't seem to care. Perhaps that was the most remarkable truth of all. The rice never pledged loyalty to one emperor over another. It responded only to water, sunlight, careful hands, and patient hearts. Dynasties came and went like passing clouds above the mountains. The terraces remained, waiting quietly for another spring, another family, another generation, willing to bend toward the earth and continue one of humanity's oldest conversations with the land. And in that quiet persistence, stronger than crowns and longer than empires, lived the true dynasty of rice itself. The next chapter, the slow arrival of harvest season, follows the breathtaking transformation of the terraces from lush summer green to shimmering autumn gold. As months of hope, labor, and patience finally approach their long-awaited reward. Part 16. Korean Mountain Terraces. If mountains possessed personalities, the Korean peninsula's mountains would probably be described as politely stubborn. Beautiful? Without question. Peaceful? Most of the time. Easy places to grow rice? Absolutely not. And yet, as human beings have demonstrated throughout history, telling determined farmers that something is difficult is often interpreted as a rather enthusiastic invitation to try anyway. For thousands of years, Korean farming families looked at steep hillsides and rugged valleys and saw something different from everyone else. They saw possibility, not immediate possibility, certainly not easy possibility, the sort of possibility that required decades of work, perhaps centuries, several generations of sore backs, an unreasonable number of stones, and enough patience to make even the mountains quietly admit defeat. As our own mountain village settled into the gentle warmth of early summer, the rice had grown knee-high. The brilliant emerald terraces reflected drifting white clouds, while dragonflies hovered lazily above the water. The frantic pace of transplanting had given way to slower, careful maintenance. Every morning still began before sunrise. But now there was time to notice the valley again. The scent of pine carried on the breeze, the distant sound of flowing streams, children laughing somewhere beyond the next terrace wall. Even the mountains seemed less demanding, at least until they remembered another retaining wall needed repairing. Across the sea, on the Korean peninsula, farmers shared many of the same challenges. The landscape offered surprisingly little broad, flat land compared to some neighboring regions. Instead, mountains dominated the horizon. Narrow valleys separated rugged ridges. Fast-flowing streams carved winding paths through the countryside. For anyone interested in building rice terraces, it was both wonderful and slightly inconvenient. Nature had provided abundant water. She had simply arranged the ground in a rather adventurous fashion. Rather than surrender to geography, Korean farming communities adapted with extraordinary determination. Small terraces appeared wherever the land allowed. Some followed narrow valleys. Others climbed gentle mountain slopes. Still others occupied tiny pockets of fertile earth tucked between rocky hillsides. Visitors sometimes wondered how anyone had managed to cultivate such unlikely places. The farmers usually wondered something much more practical, whether tomorrow's weather would cooperate. One young traveler from a distant city arrived in a mountain village during late spring. Looking across the terraces, he asked an elderly farmer, "Who built all of this?" The old man rested his hoe against one shoulder and looked thoughtfully across the valley. "My grandfather." He pointed toward another section. His grandfather, another terrace, and probably someone else's grandfather before that. The traveler blinked. "So, nobody really knows?" The old farmer smiled. "We know." He tapped the wooden handle of his hoe. "It just took a very long time." History often celebrates buildings completed within a king's lifetime. Terraces ignored such deadlines completely. Many evolved gradually over generations. One family expanded a retaining wall. Their children added another level. Their grandchildren improved the irrigation channel. No single builder deserved all the credit. Everyone shared a small piece of it. That may be one reason terraces feel so alive. They are less like monuments and more like conversations stretching across centuries. During Korea's Goryeo dynasty, which ruled from the 10th through the 14th century, agriculture remained the foundation of society. Rice cultivation expanded steadily in regions where climate and geography permitted. Governments encouraged irrigation projects. Communities worked together to improve farmland. Local knowledge accumulated slowly, each generation learning from the successes and occasionally the spectacular mistakes of those before them. One imagines there was at least one unfortunate ancestor who looked at a steep hillside and confidently declared, "This wall should be perfectly strong." The mountain, judging by later repairs, respectfully disagreed. By the time of the Joseon dynasty, beginning in 1392, Korean agriculture had become increasingly organized. Confucian ideals shaped village life, emphasizing cooperation, family responsibility, and respect for elders. The farming household functioned much as we have already seen in our own valley. Grandparents preserved experience. Parents carried the greatest physical burden. Children learned through observation. Long before anyone formally called it education, the fields became classrooms. The mountains became patient teachers. Lessons, admittedly, were sometimes delivered with considerable mud. One cool morning, a grandmother led her two grandchildren along a narrow terrace wall. The younger child looked nervously at the water below. "What if I fall?" The grandmother smiled gently. "Then you'll become muddy." The child considered this carefully. "And then you'll wash." The little boy frowned. "That's all?" She laughed softly. "The mountain usually gives everyone one good fall." She paused. "The wise only need one." That seemed reassuring. Mostly, one summer evening, an elderly woman gathered several children around while repairing a woven basket. She held up 2 handfuls of rice seeds. "They look the same." The children nodded. "But they are not." One little girl leaned closer. "How can you tell?" The grandmother smiled. "By planting them." There it was again, another quiet lesson. The earth reveals truths that eyes alone cannot see. When the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty, during the 13th century, China entered another new chapter. Empires changed. Rulers spoke different languages. Trade routes expanded farther across Asia. Yet, in the villages, spring still meant preparing terraces. Summer still meant tending. Rice. Autumn still meant harvest. Ordinary people often experience political revolutions differently from rulers. Many simply continue doing yesterday's work under tomorrow's government. History changes headlines. The seasons continue anyway. During the Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, agriculture remained central to imperial prosperity. Large-scale irrigation projects continued. Population increased steadily. Rice growing regions expanded further. Markets became increasingly active. Farmers sold surplus grain. Merchants transported goods between provinces. Village life gradually connected to wider commercial networks. An old grandfather, watching boats loaded with rice, might never have imagined where every sack would eventually travel. Then again, perhaps he did not need to. His responsibility ended where the harvest began. The Qing dynasty inherited both the achievements and challenges of those earlier centuries. By then, rice had become deeply woven into Chinese identity across much of the South. Terraces climbed mountainsides. River valleys shimmered with flooded fields. Families repeated planting rituals whose origins stretched so far into the past that no one remembered who first began them. That is often the greatest sign of a successful tradition. Everyone remembers the practice. No. One remembers needing to invent it. One traveler from another land visited southern China during the 18th century. Standing above an enormous valley of terraces, he reportedly struggled to believe human hands had shaped so much of the mountainside. The terraces stretched upward like giant staircases disappearing into the clouds. He admired their beauty. The local farmers admired something else entirely. Whether the irrigation gate near the upper wall required another repair before the next rainfall. Perspective changes everything. As our own village settled into another peaceful evening, the young rice swayed gently beneath the fading light. The children chased dragonflies between the terrace paths. Grandparents sat outside their homes, mending baskets and sharing stories. Somewhere, a traveling merchant carried news of distant officials and changing politics. The villagers listened politely. Then someone asked a far more immediate question. Will tomorrow be sunny? Because tomorrow determined whether weeds could be cleared, whether terrace walls needed reinforcing, whether irrigation channels required cleaning. Empires mattered. Tomorrow's weather mattered first. The boy looked across the valley and asked his grandfather one final question. So many dynasties have ruled China. His grandfather nodded. They have. Which one grew the best rice? The old man laughed so warmly that several nearby neighbors turned to look. I don't know. He reached down and gently touched a healthy green stalk. But this one, he smiled at the child, doesn't seem to care. Perhaps that was the most remarkable truth of all. Though rice never pledged loyalty to one emperor over another, it responded only to water, sunlight, careful hands, and patient hearts. Dynasties came and went, like passing clouds above the mountains. The terraces remained, waiting quietly for another spring, another family, another generation willing to bend toward the earth and continue one of humanity's oldest conversations with the land. And in that quiet persistence, stronger than crowns and longer than empires, lived the true dynasty of rice itself. The next chapter, the slow arrival of harvest season, follows the breathtaking transformation of the terraces from lush summer green to shimmering autumn gold as months of hope, labor, and patience finally approach their long-awaited reward. Part 16. Korean Mountain Terraces. If mountains possessed personalities, the Korean Peninsula's mountains would probably be described as politely stubborn. Beautiful, without question. Peaceful, most of the time. Easy places to grow rice? Absolutely not. And yet, as human beings have demonstrated throughout history, telling determined farmers that something is difficult is often interpreted as a rather enthusiastic invitation to try anyway. For thousands of years, Korean farming families looked at steep hillsides and rugged valleys and saw something different from everyone else. They saw possibility, not immediate possibility, certainly not easy possibility, the sort of possibility that required decades of work, perhaps centuries, several generations of sorebacks, an unreasonable number of stones, and enough patience to make even the mountains quietly admit defeat. As our own mountain village settled into the gentle warmth of early summer, the rice had grown knee-high. The brilliant emerald terraces reflected drifting white clouds while dragonflies hovered lazily above the water. The frantic pace of transplanting had given way to slower, careful maintenance. Every morning still began before sunrise, but now there was time to notice the valley again. The scent of pine carried on the breeze, the distant sound of flowing streams, children laughing somewhere. Beyond the next terrace wall, even the mountains seemed less demanding, at least until they remembered another retaining wall needed repairing. Across the sea, on the Korean peninsula, farmers shared many of the same challenges. The landscape offered surprisingly little broad, flat land compared to some neighboring regions. Instead, mountains dominated the horizon. Narrow valleys separated rugged ridges. Fast-flowing streams carved winding paths through the countryside. For anyone interested in building rice terraces, it was both wonderful and slightly inconvenient. Nature had provided abundant water. She had simply arranged the ground in a rather adventurous fashion. Rather than surrender to geography, Korean farming communities adapted with extraordinary determination. Small terraces appeared wherever the land allowed. Some followed narrow valleys. Others climbed gentle mountain slopes. Still others occupied tiny pockets of fertile earth tucked between rocky hillsides. Visitors sometimes wondered how anyone had managed to cultivate such unlikely places. The farmers usually wondered something much more practical: whether tomorrow's weather would cooperate. One young traveler from a distant city arrived in a mountain village during late spring. Looking across the terraces, he asked an elderly farmer, "Who built all of this?" The old man rested his hoe against one shoulder and looked thoughtfully across the valley. "My grandfather." He pointed toward another section. His grandfather, another terrace, and probably someone else's grandfather before that. The traveler blinked. "So, nobody really knows." The old farmer smiled. "We know." He tapped the wooden handle of his hoe. "It just took a very long time." History often celebrates buildings completed within a king's lifetime. Terraces ignored such deadlines completely. Many evolved gradually over generations. One family expanded a retaining wall. Their children added another level. Their grandchildren improved the irrigation channel. No single builder deserved all the Credit. Everyone shared a small piece of it. That may be one reason. Terraces feel so alive, they are less like monuments and more like conversations stretching across centuries. During Korea's Goryeo dynasty, which ruled from the 10th through the 14th century, agriculture remained the foundation of society. Rice cultivation expanded steadily in regions where climate and geography permitted. Governments encouraged irrigation projects that communities worked together to improve farmland. Local knowledge accumulated slowly, each generation learning from the successes and occasionally the spectacular mistakes of those before them. One imagines there was at least one unfortunate ancestor who looked at a steep hillside and confidently declared, "This wall should be perfectly strong." The mountain, judging by later repairs, respectfully disagreed. By the time of the Joseon dynasty, beginning in 1392, Korean agriculture had become increasingly organized. Confucian ideals shaped village life, emphasizing cooperation, family responsibility, and respect for elders. The farming household functioned much as we have already seen in our own valley. Grandparents preserved experience. Parents carried the greatest physical burden. Children learned through observation long before anyone formally called it education. The fields became classrooms. The mountains became patient teachers. Lessons, admittedly, were sometimes delivered with considerable mud. One cool morning, a grandmother led her two grandchildren along a narrow terrace wall. The younger child looked nervously at the water below. "What if I fall?" The grandmother smiled gently. "Then you'll become muddy." The child considered this carefully. "And then you'll wash." The little boy frowned. "That's all?" She laughed softly. "The mountain usually gives everyone one good fall." She paused. "The wise only need one." That seemed reassuring. Mostly.